The night the fields turned black, the night air smelled like damp earth and ocean salt. Liam Byrne stood at the edge of his small potato plot with a lantern in his hand, listening to the soft hiss of rain on leaves. From the lane he heard the slow creak of a cart and a far dog's bark, the simple night sounds. Nora took the children to a church kitchen where a nun with tired eyes handed out bowls. The soup was thin but warm. Aoife smiled at the heat rising against her face. Maggie held her bowl with both hands and made her sips last. Dan tried to give some back to baby John, who was asleep and dreaming of milk. The nun touched Nora's arm. "There's a room 3 floors up, in a tenement on Francis Street," she said. "It's small, the window sticks, but there's a door that shuts." The words felt like a gift, though Nora understood the price. Stairs that would take strength they did not have yet. Neighbors too thin to look at each other for long. A landlord who would want coins, even when coins were the last thing a person could find. That night they climbed the stairs, with the careful quiet of people moving into a place that does not belong to them. The room was narrow and bright with a single crooked window. A bed frame leaned against the wall. The corner smelled like old bread. Liam set the blankets down and closed the door. The sound of the latch was a comfort that surprised him. He kissed the children's heads. He held Nora's hand. "We are here," he said, "not because here was good, but because here was not the lane, not the rain, not the field that had turned to grief in one night." He lay down on the floor and listened again to the city's breath, footsteps and whispers, a child counting in a game he could not see, a cartwheel, a new cough in the room below. He thought of the field in the moonlight, the black leaves shining as if wet with ink, and he let the picture fade. In its place he held another, his children's faces above bowls of steam. The way steam can look like hope when a person has not seen hope in a long time. Tomorrow he would try the key again. Tomorrow Nora would go to the church. Tomorrow Maggie would find water and make the bed frame stand and teach Aoife a new rhyme to keep her from folding into worry. Tomorrow Dan would pull the cart to the market and listen for whispers of small jobs. Tomorrow would ask more than today had left in them. But tonight, for a few hours, there was a door between them and the world. And behind that door, a family that still knew each other's names. Liam closed his eyes. Outside, Dublin turned in its sleep. A door that shuts the room on Francis Street was narrow as a hallway and bright with one stubborn window. It opened only if you lifted and pushed at the same time, and even then it moved the width of a finger. Still, it was a door that shut, a latch that clicked, a place where they could put blankets on a floor that belonged to them for a night, and God willing, the next dot Nora spread the blankets and tucked baby John into the softest corner. His breath was fast and light. His cheeks were pale, the way a moon looks when a thin cloud crosses it. She pressed her nose to his hair. He smelled like milk that was almost not there, and wool, and the faint smoke that lived in this building the way trees live in fields. She whispered the rhythm mothers use when they want to slow a child's heart and their own. "Hush now, hush now, hush." Maggie tested the crooked bed frame. It groaned, but it stood. She wiped the slats with a cloth and spread one blanket there. For Aoife, who was fighting sleep the way the small and brave do, with blinks like little fists. Dan set the pot in the corner near the window and stacked their things as if a neat pile could push back hunger. Liam sat with his back to the door, as if he could hold it shut by being there. The tenement had a sound that did not stop. It wasn't loud, it was constant. A floorboard creaked 2 rooms over. Water dripped in a slow count from a pipe. Someone coughed like a saw in an old shed. Now and then a baby cried for a little, and then a voice tired, patient carried the crying down to a softer place. It was a house of many families doing the same sums, eating the same thin soup, telling the same story in different rooms. Morning brought the business of staying alive. The church kitchen would open after first light. The dock might have work when the tide turned. The landlord's man would come on Thursdays to collect. Between those fixed points they had to make something like a day. Water first, Nora said, then the kitchen. Maggie, you come with me. Dan, help your father to the key. Aoife, keep close to my skirt when we walk, and we'll count steps to make it a game. They took the big tin pitcher and a smaller pail and went down the stairs, careful with each step. The stairs were damp. The handrail was smooth in the places where many hands had slid over it. The courtyard behind the tenement held a pump. The sighed when pulled and gave water with the slow pride of a tired beast. People stood with their pails and jugs and cups, faces still soft from sleep, voices low so as not to wake what peace the morning had dot. An older woman with a blue shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders nodded at Nora. New ones, she said, not unkind. I'm Moira Oderly, 3rd floor, end of the hall. Don't drink the first drawer. Let the pipe spit out the rust. She pumped once, twice, and brown water came and ran into the drain. The 3rd pool ran clearer. There, she said. It's not sweet, but it's water. Thank you, Nora said. We're the Burns. We are all something like that now, Moira said, and moved aside so Nora could set the pitcher under the spout. If the baby needs milk, sister. Agnes at the kitchen keeps a little aside when she can. Say your need, and say it steady. She won't like it, but she will listen. Nora noted the name and tucked it in the pocket of her mind the way she used to tuck pins into the hem of her dress when she still did mending for neighbors. She gripped the pump and pulled. The handle fought and then gave. The first stream was yellow, then clearer. She filled the pitcher and pail and thanked the woman again. They walked the streets with measured steps. The light was thin. Smoke held to the rooftops as if it could not find the sky. Dublin had many faces, Nora thought. And this face, the early one, was the kind that shows the truth. Women with pails, boys with brooms, men walking toward the harbour before their shadows woke. The church kitchen lived behind a low wall, in the yard of a parish house that had been painted long ago. The paint peeled like paper near the ground. A bell on a rope hung by the door. A line already formed along the wall. Quiet boaties close. Hands around bowls and cups brought from home. A nun with a round face and deep line sister, Agnes, Nora. Guests moved from person to person, counting heads, answering in a tone that was firm without being hard. Nora fell into the end of the line with Maggie and Aoife. The smell of broth drifted from inside, thin but warm. When their turn came, Sister Agnes looked up, eyes sharp, not unkind. New to us, she said. Yes, sister. We came yesterday. We've water and blankets. The baby. Nora tilted her head toward John's bundle against her chest. Sister Agnes's eyes softened a hair. We stretch what we have, she said. No promises, only attempts. She ladled soup into their tin cups. It was more hot than heavy, but it was not nothing. There is a smaller pot, the sister added. For infants, it is oats and water and a scrap of milk when we have it. I will bring some to the door at noon. If you are here, it is yours. If you are not, I will give it to the next tiny one and not feel guilty, because guilt feeds no one. She moved on. They sat on the low wall to eat. Steam rose around their faces and made the cold less sharp for a few minutes. Aoife smiled into her cup as if steam were a story with a happy end. Maggie ate slow on purpose, counting spoons in her head. Nora touched baby John's cheek and felt heat that worried her. He was not burning, but he was warmer than the room. At the quay, the wind had a bite. Liam and Dan stood back from the group of men as the merchant made his slow inspection, picking work the way a raven picks seeds. Sean lifted his chin to Ward. "The boy, keep him behind you when the picking starts," he murmured. "A shove can turn a child's leg and make trouble you cannot afford." The merchant pointed. You, not Liam." "Not today." Sean moved a little closer to the man in the coat. "If you need a second shift," he said, "I'll be at the ropes." The merchant did not answer, but he saw Sean, and being seen by a man who chooses is better than being air. Dan watched the barrels roll down the planks into the hold. The grain made a sound like dry rain. He imagined it as breakfast for 1,000 people somewhere else. He swallowed and wished he had not. They walked back along the river. Liam kept his face plain and his step steady. He did not speak until they turned up from the quay toward Christchurch. "No work," Dan said, though it was plain. "No work today," Liam said. "Tomorrow the tide will be different." He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did well. You watched. Watching is work too." They met Nora at the kitchen wall at noon. Sister Agnes emerged with a small tin pot and scanned the line. "The infant burn," she said. "There." She put the pot in Nora's hands, the way a person passes a lit candle. "It is thin, it is safe. Warm it again at home if you can. And listen, if the baby will not swallow, touch the spoon to his lip and let it rest, then try again. Do not rush him." "Thank you," Nora said. They carried the little pot home like treasure. In the room, Nora set the pot near the window, where the light was honest. She tested a spoon on her wrist. Warm, not hot. She touched the spoon to baby John's lip. He turned his face, and then, inch by inch, took the taste. He swallowed, thin and careful. The room held its breath with him. He swallowed again. Nora let out a long quiet that was mostly relief and a little fear. "Good lad," she whispered. "Take your strength in sips." That afternoon, Maggie found a job of 30 minutes and 6 pennies sweeping. The steps of an empty shop for a man with keys who looked like he once had pride and now had a plan and not much else. She swept slow and made neat piles. The man watched with eyes that had counted inventory for years. He gave her 7 pennies instead of 6 and did not say why. "Put 3 aside," Nora told her when she spread the coins on the floor. "We pay the landlord's man on Thursday, or he will take the window. The other 4 we will turn into food." "What kind?" Maggie asked. "The kind that keeps," Nora said. "Oats if they're not dear. A bone if the butcher is kind. To children who ask turnips if they smell sweet. We do not waste a penny on anything that looks proud." As dusk came, the tenement woke to its evening habits. Voices grew a shade louder. A fiddle tested a note somewhere up the stair and stopped, probably because the player remembered how sound carries in hunger and chose silence to be kind. Someone boiled laundry and the sharp soap smell rose through the boards. Moira knocked and came in with a heel of bread wrapped in cloth. "The baker's wife saved it for a church basket," she said. "The basket came late. I argued. She let it go. You take it." The baby needs mothers who can stand up without swaying. Nora wanted to refuse. She wanted to keep pride in a pocket like a coin. She looked at Moira and saw a woman who had fought the same fight inside herself and chosen to eat so she could live to fight again tomorrow. Nora nodded and took the bread. "We'll return the kindness," she said. "Not today, but it will come back around." "It always does," Moira said. She looked at the baby, asleep with his mouth open, breath soft and even. "He looks less hollow," she said, which was the finest compliment a mother could hear that week, on that street, in that city. She left as quietly as she had come. Later, a shout rose from the alley by the market and snapped like a stick. A fight over a sack, or a rumor of a sack, which is the same thing when rumors are all people have. Liam moved to the window and did not lift it. He knew the rules now. If the market shouts, you step away. If running feet come, you stand still and let the river of bodies pass. If someone falls, you weigh your help against the fact that you have children. If a child falls, you forget the rules and you help anyway. He wished for a world where such rules were not a thing a person needed to know. They ate their soup thin and their bread in thumb-sized squares. Nora kept a slice back and did not tell anyone. At midnight, when the baby whimpered, she broke the slice, dipped it in warm water, and sucked it to soften it. She took a bite for herself that was hardly a taste, to keep her milk from dying entirely. She did not weep. She stared at the window until the shape of the frame steadied the inside of her head. In the days that followed, a pattern tried to form and kept slipping. Some mornings the key needed hands for an hour, and Liam came home with a coin that looked bigger because it was a circle of time when he was chosen. Some mornings there was nothing but the sound of barrels and the sight of other men's backs. The kitchen line sometimes stretched around the corner. Sometimes the pot was empty before they reached the door, and Sister Agnes stood on the step with her hands open to show they held air. Once a crowd formed at Cork Hill because someone said a wagon had come with grain for sale cheap. It was not cheap, and it was not for the crowd. A man tried to climb onto the wagon board. Another pulled him down. A third shouted a word that began a fight. Liam stood where Sean had taught him, 2 steps back from the tightest press. One hand on Dan's shoulder, the other free, eyes on the sides, not the center. A guard with a baton swung high. The baton made a sound like a stick on a fence. The wagon moved, and the crowd moved with it like a tired sea. When it was done, the grain was gone to a locked door, and a woman sat on the cobbles with her hands around nothing. Sean helped her stand. He did it as if it were the most work he had done that week. In the tenement, small economies bloomed and faded. A woman on the first floor could stretch a bone into a broth that tasted like more than bone, for a price measured in minutes of sweeping or a scrap of soap. A boy on the second floor knew which baker's back door sometimes had crumbs, and which had a dog. A man on the 4th floor mended shoes for a thin coin or a promise. Promises were a kind of money now. So were stories. Maggie began trading rhymes to teach Aoife and 2 little ones from next door. In return, she got a turn at a better spot, near the kitchen door, or news about the time the dockmaster liked to start his picking on days he wore his grey coat. Learning people's habits was part of the job of living. On Thursday, the landlord's man came with a ledger and a look that said he knew every person's worry before they spoke it and cared for none of them. Liam had coins enough for half. He set them on the page and waited for the blow. "Half," the man said. He licked his finger and turned a page. "Next week, the rest. We will have it," Liam said. "Or I will have the window," the man said. He did not smile. When he left, Nora let out a breath she had held for a week. "A window can go," she said. "We will keep the door." That night, baby John slept with his mouth closed and his breath slow. Nora watched the rise and fall under her hand. She could not feel plenty in that small chest, but she could feel not empty. And not empty was a word they would keep for as long as it carried them. Liam lay on the floor with his arm over his eyes and listened to the house. In the room below, a man told a story in a low voice about fishing in a year when fish were easy. He was telling it to a boy who had never seen easy fish. On the stair, a girl stepped light, carrying a bucket and the soft song of someone careful not to wake a baby. Somewhere a woman laughed once, quick and bright, as if she had surprised herself, and then stopped, as if laughter was something a person should not spend all at once. The door was shut. The wind ticked at the window like a fingernail. They were inside. Outside, the city breathed in and out and did not stop. In the morning, they would go again to the quay. Nora would stand again at the kitchen wall. Maggie would sweep and count and trade rhymes for news. Dan would learn the way a foreman's shoulders carry decisions. Aoife would practice tying her shoes so the string held until evening. Baby John would take the spoon on his lip and swallow in sips. It was not triumph. It was not defeat. It was a middle that people can live in longer than they think, and in a place not far from their room, behind a locked door that had not yet learned how to open. A warehouse full of grain sat quiet, while the city made plans in whispers and waited for a day that would change the story's shape. Bread lines and barrels, the river wore a skin of morning light. Liam and Dan reached the quay before the bell in Christchurch finished its first slow note. Ropes lay in lazy coils. Gulls argued like pickpockets. A cold, salt breath moved through the gap between warehouses and slipped under collars, making men straighten and set their jaws. Sean stood where he always stood, not in front, not in back to steps off the center, where a foreman's eye could catch him without effort. He lifted his chin when he saw Liam. "Tide's with us," he said. "When the tide is generous, sometimes men are too." The dockmaster came in his grey coat, the one that meant he would count slower and pick faster. He scanned faces as if reading labels. "Hands," he said. A finger tapped the air. 1, 2, 3. "You and you, Berniers." The boy stays behind the line. Dan kept his face flat, the way Liam had taught him, but his fingers tightened on the cart handle. Sean touched the boy's shoulder. "We will make a rope man of you yet," he said, easy and low. "Rope men begin by watching knots. Today you watch." The ship's name was painted in chipped letters. Nabel and her hold breathed grain scent and dark. Sacks sat in ranks like silent soldiers, waiting to be shouldered to the gangplank, walked to the cart, rolled to the warehouse where locks had more shine than the men who tended them. "Mind the dust," Sean warned as they stepped into the hold. "It finds throats. Drink when they tell you not to." They began the day's arithmetic. Sack, step, plank, cart, turn. The canvas rasped against shirts gone thin. Grain dust rose and turned the lantern light into pale fog. Liam's hands remembered. Old strength. The ache that came with it felt like an old friend who had finally knocked at the door after too long away. Halfway through the first hour, a sack tore with a low, ugly sound. A pale spill of wheat avalanched over the plank and onto the stones, tiny suns rolling in every direction. The dockmaster's face tightened. "Keep moving," he said. "Weigh the loss and mark it, sweepers." Two boys appeared with brooms. Not hired, not official. Their hopes were mostly for the grains, small enough to escape the brush. The kind that collect along curb edges and can be fingered into pockets. If a person is quick and the foreman looks the other way, Dan watched them the way a student watches a master. It wasn't theft exactly, he thought. It was a boy's bargain with luck. Liam bent and scooped what he could back into a torn sack, cupping his palm so the wheat ran like water into the canvas. The dockmaster saw and said nothing. Sean worked beside him without comment, his breath steady, his eyes on hands and feet and the rhythm that saves backs. By mid-morning, the men's shoulders had turned the color of flour. The world tasted like wheat and iron. Liam paused at the gangplank to swallow a mouth of river-cold water from a ladle, and felt the clean cut of it all the way to his belly. He saw Dan beyond the line, standing with his hands in his pockets like a man and his feet set like a boy, hungry. Liam asked when the whistle called a short break. Dan nodded. "I can wait." "We all can," Sean said, coming up, "and we all shouldn't." He pulled a crust from his coat. It was hard as a board. He cracked it on the rail and gave the larger piece to the boy. "Don't chew the corner off your tongue," he said, almost smiling. "Bread fights back when it's old." They ate with their backs to the warehouse, eyes on the water. On the far quay, a cart rolled under guard. Toward a door painted the color of money. The sacks on that cart were plump and unafraid. A woman stood in the street near the door, hands folded, not begging, not moving. Just looking as if looking could turn a lock. Sean followed Liam's eyes. "We load for elsewhere," he said. Not angry, only tired. Elsewhere eats fine. The break ended. Back to the hold. Back to the shoulder, the plank, the cart, the turn. Liam let the work carry him the way a river carries a man who has learned not to fight every curve. His mind travelled in small circles. Rent, soup, baby John's breath under Nora's hand, Maggie's slow counting of spoons, Aoife's shoes tied with string. He steadied each thought with the next lift. When the day's last sack thumped into the warehouse scale, the dockmaster marked his book with the nib of a pen that had likely never felt hunger. He paid in coins warm from his palm too few, but coins are coins when the alternative is air. Liam felt their weight with a craftsman's attention, then slid them into his pocket like secret heat. "Tomorrow," the master said to no one and everyone, and snapped the book shut. Outside the dock gate, a line had formed by the flour Chester charity barrel, overseen by a clerk who wore his pity like a scarf. The system was a system only when it worked. A token from the church, a measure into a sack, a name checked on a list. Today, word had outrun tokens. People had brought sacks without paper. Others had paper without patience. The clerk held up both hands. "Tokens first," he said. A murmur rose, the way wind rises before rain. A woman near the front, the kind of thin that makes faces sharp, held up her child's shawl instead of a ticket. "He will not last the week," she said. Flat, not crying. "If I must pay, I will pay later. Give me a scoop now." "Tokens first," the clerk repeated, and reached for the measure. The first scoop fell into a bag with a sound that should have been peace and wasn't. An elbow came from somewhere behind, sudden and mean. The woman stumbled. Her sack tipped. The scoop man lifted again, hesitated. Rules or mercy? Mercy or rules? And that moment was enough for the crowd to push. The barrel rocked, flour side into air. White dust turned faces into ghosts and tempers into fire. Liam did what Sean had taught him, 2 steps back, one hand on Dan, eyes on the edges. The first shove carried the weight of 100 hungers. A second shove came with a word that can start a brawl in any language. A boy slipped. He could have been Dan's size. His head struck a cobble. The sound was small and awful. Sean moved first. Not forward, never into the teeth, but sideways. Into the gap that opens when men stop seeing. He crouched, hooked 2 fingers in the boy's collar, pulled once and then again, clean and quick, and put the child between his knees like a carpenter setting a board safe from a blade. "Up," he said. The boy's eyes were open and glassy. "Up, lad." The boy tried and failed. A baton cracked the air. The guard who swung it was scared and sure. He was not cruel. Fear can look like cruelty when it moves fast. Liam felt the old heat lift in him, the kind that makes a man do brave and stupid things. He put Dan behind him and stepped to where Sean knelt. "Back," the guard shouted and swung again. The baton's arc cut flour dust into a small, cruel rainbow. It would have split Sean's ear if Liam hadn't put his shoulder where a head would be. The blow turned his world white for a breath. He tasted metal. He did not fall. "Back," Sean echoed, but quieter, and to the people, not the guard. "Back now." He said it the way you talk to a spooked horse. His calm made a space. Moira Blue's shawl from the tenement was there suddenly, God knows from where, with her hands up and wide, making room with the shape of her arms. "Hold," she said to a woman whose face had become a blade. "Your child is watching." The woman blinked as if a light had been lit, and let her hands fall. The clerk, pale now, lifted the scoop again, but Sean caught his wrist not hard, not long. "Measure," he said, looking in the man's eyes, "and breathe. We are not thieves if you don't make us be." The clerk swallowed and nodded, and began to work in a rhythm that felt almost like prayer. Scoop, pour, step, scoop, pour, step. The guard, seeing order where there had been none, lowered his baton to a threat instead of a promise. Liam touched his shoulder and found a lump rising like a second bone. He kept his face plain. Dan stared up at him, too much man and too much boy at once. "I'm fine," Liam said. Heads harder than sticks. He tried a smile. The smile tried back. By the time the barrel's bottom thudded, the line was thin and quiet. The woman without a token had a half measure in her Shulmara's half, passed hand to hand while the clerk looked the other way. She saw what had been done, met Moira's eyes, and said nothing. Gratitude, when it is the size of a life, has trouble finding words. Sean hauled the boy to his feet and made sure both of his eyes pointed the same direction. "Go home," he said to the child's sister, who had appeared with a face made of fear and fury. "Slow, don't run. If you run, he'll fall. Walk and keep his head still as soup." The girl did as told, because the voice had the weight of someone who had said such things before and seen people live because of it. "Your shoulder," Sean said to Liam, when the dust began to settle. "It will be a story tomorrow," Liam said. "Tonight it's a pain." He glanced at Dan. "We'll buy a bone," they did, at a butcher who had learned to say a price and then look at a boy until the price set itself again, lower. They bought 2 turnips, a handful of oats, a heel of bread that had been a heel the day before. Coins clicked from Liam's hand to the counter, and felt like power in transit. They carried the food through streets that were trying hard to be evening again, lamps being coaxed to life, doors closing on contraband warmth, a girl humming one note of a song because more would be wasteful. By the pump, Maggie waited with the tin pitcher and the news. "Sister Agnes says she's saving me a place by the stove if I scrub pots," she said, proud of the words saving and place in the same sentence. "And the landlord's man went by early today and did not knock on our door. He had a look like vinegar." "Then, tomorrow he will be sweeter," Dan said, and Maggie snorted because she had been in Dublin long enough now to know vinegar. Her stamina in the room. Nora set the bone in the pot and covered it with water. The marrow would cloud the broth just enough to trick a tongue into thinking it had met meat. She added turnips, a thin fist of oats, salt scraped from the last of a paper twist. She set the pot on the little grate and fed the fire with wood. That had been a chair leg yesterday and a tree a year before that. The room filled with a smell that made shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. "Let me see," she said to Liam, when the pot had begun to mutter. He showed her the lump on his shoulder. She hissed through her teeth and fetched a cloth. "Cold first," she said, "then warm." She pressed the wet rag to the bruise. "You will sleep on your other side and tell brave lies to the children, so they don't look at you like glass." "They already do," he said. "They look at all of us like glass," she answered. "We pretend we are stone for their sake." They ate with care. Aoife called the turnip apple as a game and made her bite bigger. Baby John took his spoon the way he had learned, lip first, and swallowed without turning away. His eyes were clearer. Nora touched his forehead and found less heat. After, Maggie washed bowls with water that had been soup until it became water again. Dan sat on the floor with the broken slat he'd found in the alley and practiced to knots. Sean had shown him half hitch, clove hitch until the rope understood him. Liam lay with his bad shoulder pointed toward the door, as if to tell the world exactly where it could strike, and that he wasn't afraid of being honest. Moira knocked and stood in the door with a hammer small enough to be a toy. "Your window," she said, "rattles like bones. If you wedge this at the bottom and pack cloth at the corner, the wind will only make faces at you instead of coming in." She wedged and packed and nodded at her own work. "Not pretty," she said. "Useful. Pretty has gone to England with the grain." Nora laughed one soft, surprised sound. Dan then covered her mouth, almost embarrassed by the noise. "Stay," she said to Moira. "There's a bowl yet in the pot." Moira shook her head. "I ate," she lied with skill. "But I'll sit and hear your day, if you're telling." They told it in small pieces. The way people tell when a child is half asleep and needs to be carried by the story to the place where the night is easier. Liam left out the baton. Dan put in the part with the knots and made his hands show the rope's path. Maggie added how Sister Agnes scolded the flower clerk without raising her voice. Nora told about the baby swallow that looked like a miracle and felt like a beginning. Outside, the alley found its night noise again, boots and buck. A short song, a fox's cough, someone practicing a whistle with no tune in mind. In some other room, a couple argued in whispers that had love in them even while they sparred. On the stair, two boys tried to mime a fight from the flower line, and failed because they could not agree who had said what first. The city was not kind, but it was not dead. When the children were down and the pot washed, Liam sat by the window and let the cold through the packed cloth until his shoulders stopped. Singing, Sean's face came to him the way the man did not flinch in a crowd. The way he said breathe to a man who needed to be told how. Quiet courage, Liam thought, was a roof. You only notice it when it leaks, and often not even then, because it keeps more than rain out. It keeps panic from finding a way in. He looked down at the key. a ribbon of dark and lamp. The warehouse locks threw back a little glint where lamplight touched them. Somewhere behind one of those doors, grain waited for morning, for carts, for books with lines in which other men's names were written. He thought of the woman with folded hands outside that other door, the one painted the color of money. He wondered how long a person could stand like that before she became part of the building. "Sleep," Nora said from the blanket. "You cannot carry the city in your head when you must carry sacks in your hands." He lay down carefully, turned to the good side, and let the ache be what it was. He closed his eyes and saw not the baton, not the barrel, but the steady ladle. At the end, scoop and pour, as if order were a thing that could be held if enough hands agreed. Tomorrow they would go again to the quay, and to the kitchen, and to the pump. Tomorrow the dockmaster's coat would decide what kind of day it meant to be. Tomorrow a list somewhere would have their name near the bottom and might climb an inch on the page if a nun frowned in the right direction. Tomorrow would be like today and not like it, because hunger repeats itself and people don't. Each day they become a little different to survive. On the far side of the river, a bell counted the hour with the care of a bookkeeper. Liam, half asleep, counted it too and then lost track, which was better than keeping it, and drifted on the other side of that count. The road on James's Street held a line none of them had yet joined a gate, and a ledger, and a rule about families that broke families to keep order. It waited like a door at the edge of a dream. The workhouse gate train came in blades that morning, the kind that lean sideways and find a face even under a brim. The quay was a row of hunched backs and hands rubbed for warmth, but no foreman. The grey coat did not appear, the book did not open, and the gulls sounded irritated, as if even they expected order. Liam and Dan waited long enough to be sure the answer was no, and then turned up James's Street with fingers so cold the knuckles felt like glass dot at the kitchen. The bell. Rope hung wet and heavy. A sign Sister Agnes had written in a square. Stubborn hand was nailed to the gate. Pot thin. Come slow. Speak plain. Nora read it twice and took her place anyway. When the door swung, the smell was still a comfortinians, oats, water. That had been persuaded into soupat. The ladle moved with apology. Behind her, Maggie counted spoons under her breath, as if numbers might thicken broth. By noon, the thin had become transparent. Sister Agnes came out with her sleeves rolled and her mouth a firm line. "We stretch and we stop," she said, to the people and herself. "Enough is a word we obey when the pot says it." She looked down at baby John, pressed upright against Nora's chest, and then further in, toward the shadowed hall. "There's an infirmary ward at the Union," she added, voice low, eyes searching Nora's. "Nurses, boiled blankets. It's not kindness there, but it is care. For infants," she didn't finish. She didn't need to. They had avoided the word as if it were a cold draft. Workhouse. Everyone knew its edges. A gate that took your name. A ledger that took your pride. Rules that took what was left. You went there when the street was a last room, and even that room was closing. But baby John's breath had a rattle that made Nora's throat tighten, and the bruise on Liam's shoulder sang whenever he lifted the pot, and the landlord's man had returned with a pry bar and taken the lower pane from their window, because he could. Moira came at dusk with the hammer and more cloth. She looked at the newly opened square where glass had been and did not swear, which took effort. "They take windows first," she said. "It lets weather do the starving." She wedged and packed, her hands sure in the half-light. "If you go to the Union, go early. The porter grows harder as the day grows long." We're only asking, Nora said, as if the sentence itself might soften reality. We'll see the nurse. We'll keep the family together. Moira's mouth made a shape that wasn't a smile and wasn't a frown. They separate you, she said plainly. Men to men, women to women, children to children, babies to thee. Little ward, Sunday is talking through a rail. She touched John's warm forehead with the back of her fingers, the way women do when they've known too many fevers. If you must, you must. Go before he's too weak to take their food. They set out before first light, the 5 of them smaller under the sky than they had been yesterday. James's street climbed like a tired stair. At the top, the wall of the South Dublin Union ran long and grey, stone on stone, with a clock that kept honest time above a gate that kept everything else. The ironwork was solid in the way a locked door is solid. The rain had slowed to a stubborn mist that made hair cling and thoughts heavy. A line waited, but not the kind that shouts. It was a narrow-lipped line, a pocketed hands line, a line that had already argued with itself and lost. Men on one side, women and children on the other. A boy stood at the break between the two with his chin set like a nail. He was Dan's age, and his eyes had the wide, badly slept look of someone who understands too much for how short he is. The porter sat on a high stool under the arch, a man with a ledger and the stiff patience of a person who hands out rules for a living. Beside him, a matron with a frayed ribbon at her throat held a basket of cloth caps and looked as if she had been tired since spring. The woman in front of Nora stepped up when the stoolman lifted his chin. "Name," he said. His pen hovered, the way a gull hovers before a fall. "Parish, trade, children," he wrote, without looking at the woman while she spoke, as if ink could hear. "Any fever," he added, sharp. "We take no fever to the general wards. Fever has its own house." The woman shook her head, and the matron watched her mouth for the truth of it. The next family moved forward. Then Nora stood at the line. Baby John, warm and too quiet in her arms, Maggie steady at her elbow, Aoife wrapped so tight in the shawl she looked like a bundle of sticks, and Liam across the gap among the men, already farther away than felt possible. "Name, the porter," said Byrne. Nora answered. "Francis Street, from Wicklow before." "Parish St. Catherine's," the man said, marking it without asking. He had learned the streets by hunger. "Trade." "Labourer," Nora said, nodding toward Liam. "Dock, when there is, dock, fields, before. Children, 4, she said, and her voice tilted at the word, for as if it had to climb a step. "Maggie, 12, Dan, 9, Aoife, 6. John," she looked down. "John is months." The matron's eyes softened a fraction at the baby's name. "The infant ward has space," she said. "The women's ward does, barely. The men's," she lifted one shoulder, "will find a board to sleep on. There's washing, oakum, laundry, food at the bell. Visiting on Sundays, 1 hour after chapel. No talking over the rail after." She recited the rules like prayers that never change. "We're asking for the baby," Nora tried. "For a nurse to look at him. We can manage outside if he can. Be made strong enough to swallow." The matron's mouth made the same shape Moira's had. "We do not manage parts," she said. "Admission is admission. We're a house, not a door." Her voice wasn't cruel, it was worn. "If he's admitted, he eats on our schedule, wrapped in our cloth, under our eye. If you are admitted, you take our broth and our work. If you are not, you are not." She looked at John again, and something at the back of her face shifted. "He would be warm," she said softly. which in that place counted as kindness. Liam's fists opened and closed at his sides, over with no plan to hit anything. Dan stood in the men's line and stared straight ahead, because that is what you do when a boy wants to cry and refuses to be chased by the sound. Maggie reached for Aoife's hand and found it already reaching for hers. The baby made a small sound, a wet hitchened, then went quiet in the way that teaches a mother to fear quiet. Behind Nora, a voice spoke her name in a whisper. Burn. She turned. The blue shawl looked different over the plain brown of the workhouse dress, but the woman wearing it was still Moira. Not Moira Oderly. Moira, who had moved in 2 days after them and been gone by last night. They brought us in Tuesday, she said. My sister's lad's cough turned and the fever house took him. I'm in laundry, 3rd yard. If you come, find me. If you don't, take this. She slid a twist of something small into Maggie's hand. Maggie didn't look at it until the woman had already moved, like smoke, back toward the yard. It was a scrap of flannel and a single button wrapped up together. A useless gift. A perfect one. Liam met Nora's eyes across the space, like a person looking through a window in bad weather. He did not make a face. That was the kindness he could offer. He let her decide without the weight of his wanting. Nora looked down at the infant. She set her thumb under his tongue the way Sister Agnes had taught her and felt the little push that meant his body still remembered how to take food. His breath was faster than it should be. She tasted metal at the back of her throat, the taste of choices that count. She pictured a room with many infants and one nurse and a bell that rang when all mouths were too open, not when one small chest cried. She pictured the Sunday rail, the way hands would touch through iron and not be there. Own anymore. She pictured the door at Francis Street and the way it shuts. Not today, she said, and felt both relief and terror crack her ribs in the same place. Sister Agnes will help us stretch him 1 more week. The matron did not argue. She had learned the sound of not today. She had said it enough herself. Bring him early if you bring him, she said. We take the weakest first in the mornings while the broth is hot. They stepped out of the line and the line stitched itself. Closed behind them, a seam running straight, a garment that would not fit anyone, but accepted them all the same. Liam crossed over and put his hand under the shawl at John's back and felt the rapid rise and fall. We'll keep him warm, he said. We'll feed him every hour, even if it's nothing. They walked along the wall toward the coombe. Rain had become a hushed drizzle. The union's clock ticked loud enough in Liam's head to be a warning. Along the back lane, a visiting door stood open for a moment and let out a bell and the smell of carbolic and boiled linen. For the length of that open second, Nora saw inside a stone passage, a row of pegs with caps, a boy carrying a basket of rags like treasure, a sign painted in black that read silence, and then the door shut again and the world was street dot. They did not go home yet. It felt wrong to return to a room without trying one more door. At St. Patrick's, Father Donnelly's pocketbook came out with its slow, careful sigh. He had learned to speak in numbers he hated. 3 measures if you scrub, he told. Maggie, and a seat by the stove. To Dan, a broom by the steps until the bell. The steps like to look tidy while people are eating. To Nora, bring the baby here at noon. We'll warm the spoon and he'll forget how sore his throat is. He patted Liam's bruised shoulder exactly once, as if the hand could swallow pain, and then walked away before kindness grew teeth and bit him. They worked the church's little machine until noon made it stop. Sister Agnes warmed the pot with 2 hands cupped around it, as if heat could be encouraged by love. The baby's swallow came slow, then steadier. A patch of rose found his cheek like a traveller who'd asked directions and finally arrived. "See," Sister Agnes said, as much to herself as to Nora. "We are not winning, but we are not losing right this minute." She lifted her eyes and the stern set of her mouth returned. "Go," she said. "Rest before the evening line makes liars of us all." On Francis Street, the missing window let the room choose its weather. They hung a blanket over the hole and pushed the bed frame closer to the good wall. The children fell into a heap of blanket and breath. Liam sat with his back against the doorpost again, the way he had on the first night, and counted the beats of his shoulder until they faded into the general hum of the house. Nora folded the flannel scrap Moira had given Maggie and made it into a tiny bib for John. Stitches small, something like order in thread. Sleep came early and broke early. Liam woke to a sound like rope dragged over stone and realized it was only the city changing sides. He propped himself on an elbow and looked at the shapes of his people in the dark. The door was shut. The room wasn't warm, but it was theirs. He thought of the gate, the porter's pen, the matron's ribbon, the boy at the break between men and women with a nail for a chin, and his chest found a new tightness he hadn't noticed in the daylight. He saw, too, what he hadn't wanted to see. The way the week kept leading to that gate, the way a sentence leads to a period. Not today had been right, but the road to not today bends towards soon. He was a man who liked to make plans with his hands, tie this knot, lift that sack, mend that frame, and the gate was not a thing hands could fix. Morning pooled light under the blanket hung over the window. The room smelled faintly of boiled oats and damp cloth. The baby's breath ticked at a pace that felt like a compromise between worlds. Nora sat up slow and put her 2 palms on either side of his ribs, a mother's measuring. "We make another day," she said. Liam nodded. "We make it." Downstairs, Moira's voice floated up with the smell of soap and a tune held under the breath. A habit she had carried out with her from laundry, singing low so it didn't count as singing. On the way to the quay, Sean met them at the corner, with a look that said he knew exactly where their feet had been yesterday. He squeezed Liam's arm once, near the bruise but not on it, with the precision of a man who knows where pain lives. "The Union is a hard roof," he said. "Sometimes a hard roof is better than rain on a fever." He let the thought land, and then pushed on. "Grey coats on the dock today. He'll pick twice." They walked, and the tide moved, and the book opened, and men's names were said, and work was done. The same as always when you're still allowed to be the sort of person who is chosen in the women's line. Sister Agnes made the pot behave longer than it wanted. In the tenement, Moira hammered, wedge against a winter that kept putting its hands through people's walls. And in a corner of Dublin that looked like any other corner, a broad door painted an ordinary colour rested against a latch and waited for the day it would open in a way that would change a city's memory. A warehouse full of grain. A lock that had never learned how to doubt itself. A decision that would turn quietly in the dark until it clicked. Markets of Ghost's Cork Hill woke late, as if the market itself had decided to sleep in and hope hunger would forget where to find it. Stalls that once bloomed with noise now held only the memory of hands. Countertops wore pale scars where knives had worked happier days. Someone had chalked prices onto a slate and then rubbed them out with a sleeve so many times the board looked like fog. Liam and Nora brought the children there the way people visit a church, where they once felt lucky. If there was food to be had anywhere beyond the church pot and the dockmaster's book, it would be here at Cork Hill, at Corn Market around the bend, beneath Christchurch's stone eye and the castle's indifferent shadow. Dan pulled the cart. Maggie kept Aoife's hand tucked into her pocket so the girl wouldn't let go when something bright caught her eye, though there was little brightness left to tempt anyone. Where a fish seller's bench had stood for years, a man sat with his hat in his lap as if he were waiting for his former self to arrive. His name was Seamus O'Shea, though the sign still nailed to the post said O'Sullivan and Son in letters rubbed smooth by winter. He had the broad hands of a man who knew what a net felt like in a good year. Today those hands worried the brim off his hat until the straw began to fray. "Morning," Liam said, "because a man deserves to be greeted even when he has nothing to sell." "Morning," Seamus answered, and looked at the river as if it might confess why it kept back what men needed from it. Winds from the east. Good for some things. Not fish, it seems. Lines at the quay. Liam asked. "Lines everywhere," Seamus said. He glanced past Liam to the children without moving his head, the way fathers do when they've learned to count a family without being obvious. If a man had a handful of salt and a lie to tell, he could pass rotten mackerel as fresh and feed his own for a day. "And would you?" Nora asked, not sharp, just the kind of plain that invites truth. "Not today," he said, and his mouth tried a smile and found it too large for his face. "Today, I'm a man who remembers work. Tomorrow, I might be a man who sells a different story." A person shouldn't swear too far in either direction. The world enjoys making us liars. They moved on, past a stall with 3 sad onions arranged as if pretending to be a heap, past a table where a woman displayed broken combs and a cracked hand mirror and called them pretty with a voice that dared you to disagree. A boy there, Mag's age, stood with a basket of black bread and called it brown. He didn't know he was lying. The light was bad. At Corn Market, the crowd thickened, not with buyers, but with watchers, thin men with empty baskets. Women who came, the way a shoreline comes, inch by inch, and then all at once. Someone said out loud what everyone had heard in whispers. A wagon from the west with sacks. Not many, but more than none. Another someone said the sacks were for army stores. The two someones were both right, and that made trouble. Because truth split into 2 halves is sharper than a blade. "Hold to me," Nora told Aoife, even though the girl was already pressed against her side like a pocket. "And if you can't see me, look for Maggie's shawl." Maggie's shawl was green when it was not the color of dust. That was enough to make it a landmark. Dan kept one hand on the cart and one on the board. That made its back, the way a boy keeps a promise and a plan. The wagon turned in from Castle Street with 2 constables walking beside it in a pace meant to say calm. The horse had that brave, bewildered look horses get when they obey men who are unsure of their own orders. The sacks were tied with tidy knots, like truths kept by men who sleep well. A clerk with a hat too tall for his head stood on the tailboard and tried to look older than he was. "We've a list," he announced, holding up a paper like a priest holds a wafer. "Names from the parishes, countersigned, paid." He said paid as if the word had never done anyone harm. "We'll weigh by measure," he added, which was meant to be reassuring and failed. Someone laughed, sudden and wrong. Laughter in a hungry crowd is a spark near dry straw. It tells men they've forgotten to be careful. A woman said a name. That was not on the clerk's list and told him so. A man said the clerk could keep his ink and see how much it fed him. A second constable, younger than the first, put his hand to his baton because his hand had nowhere else to go. The horse shifted its weight and stared at the stone, wishing itself somewhere with grass. Liam felt the air tilt, 2 steps back. He told Dan, steady and low, the lesson they had learned so often it lived in their bones now. If they pull where you are not there. Sean appeared at Liam's elbow like a habit well learned. We run, Sean said, eyes on the cart and the knots and how many men could fit between the wheel and the wall. But not yet. We wait for the second shout. The first is anger. The second is decision. He set his hand lightly on Dan's shoulder and found the boy already braced. The second shout came from the edge, where a woman had fainted, or slipped, or been pushed. And the line did what lines do, it forgot it was a line, and remembered it was many bodies. The clerk held his paper higher, as if height could save rules. Someone's elbow caught the twine of the nearest sack, and worried it without meaning to. A handful of wheat spilled like a gasp. The sound made the crowd lean 3 inches forward, which might as well have been miles. The older constable lifted both hands. Back, he called, and the word worked on some and not on others. The younger swung his baton in a circle that said, I'm scared as much as I'm in charge. It clipped a man's shoulder, then a woman's knuckles. Flour in the other sacks. Took the moment to sigh loose. Now the air had ghosts again. White dust turning faces into masks of accusation. Move the horse, Sean told the older constable, not loud, not deferent, just sane. The cart is a wall, and men run at walls. The constable looked at Sean with the relief of a man who wants to be told what to do. He tapped the horse's rump and clicked. The animal took 1 step forward, then another. The wall was a gate again. The pressure changed. Good, Sean said softly, and he said it like a prayer so the city might hear. The clerk, instead of finding his own good sense, found the only sense he knew: procedure. Tokens, first, he cried, the way he'd been taught at a desk. He reached for the tide sack, fumbled the knot, and spilled a scoop that had no owner because his list was no use under weather like this. Any child could have been the one. Shot under a man's elbow the way water finds a crack in stone. Not even a boy with a yellow scarf and a brave sister who shouted his name until it became a rope he could follow back. The boy bent, grabbed a double handful of wheat in both fists, and froze as if his feet had been nailed to the cobbles. He looked at the older constable. The older constable looked at his baton. In that breath, the city had a vote. Go, Sean said to the boy, flat, a word you can't argue with, and put his hand, not hard, not soft, against the child's back. The boy ran. His sister ran after him, scolding and crying and laughing, all at once. One done, Sean said, as if ticking a line in a ledger. A sharp voice cut through flour and fear. Enough. Sister Agnes stood at the edge of the crowd with her sleeves rolled and her eyes like gate hinges. How she had arrived nobody could say. She simply knew where to be when the boil needed lowering. You, she told the clerk, pointing with a ladle she'd brought as if it were a scepter. Measure steady. You, she told the older constable. Keep your stick low and your head high. To the younger, rest your arm. You will not prove you're a man by breaking one. To the people, we will not bury anyone for a handful not properly weighed. She could have moved a ship with that voice. She moved a market, and so the impossible happened. Order like a blanket pulled up. The clerk measured into sacks. Scoops when half scoops were all that remained. Those with tokens got more than those without. Those without got not nothing. Men breathed through their noses instead of their teeth. Women straightened their backs, not because they felt strong, but because a nun had looked at them and expected it. When the last grain fell, the younger constable lowered his baton for real and seemed surprised by how light his arm felt. Liam found he had been holding air in his throat for a long minute. He let it go slow. Nora squeezed his hand once, quick. Secret, the market settled into the tide that follows danger and is almost as bad as danger itself. A hawker across the way began calling pins and needles in a voice that sounded like a woman pretending to talk about anything that wasn't food. Turned toward home with a quarter sack and 2 onions, too tired to argue that they were worth anything. Seamus O'Shea, hat back on his head now, watched them pass and tipped the brim. He had a parcel wrapped in paper under his arm, and he kept changing his mind about whether to tuck it further in or let it show. For the wife, he told Liam, when their eyes met, as if it needed to be said. Not much, but enough to make a pan remember it's a pan. May the pan be generous, Liam said. Pans can be taught, Seamus said. Men, too. On the slope by Christchurch, a fiddler sawed 2 notes and stopped, then tried again and made a 3rd note join them. The tune failed to be born and still made something like comfort. Aoife lifted her feet higher for 2 steps because the music had asked them to. Maggie counted under her breath 1 2 1 2. 1 2 because numbers make crowds less like weather and more like math. Dan pushed the cart with his good shoulder and tried to make his grip look like it did not hurt. At the pump behind the tenement, Moira stood with her blue shawl and a story already leaving her mouth. Laundry yard took my hands entire, she said, showing the pinks of her fingers where water and soap had gnawed. But the matron's cat had kittens, and my Mary, that is, not mine. The neighbours smiled like I haven't since Lent. Smile's a kind of food if you take it slow. They carried small winnings up the stairs, as if the stairs were applauding. Nora set the quarter sack on the floor and ran her palm over the fabric the way a woman touches a baby's blanket. We'll grind it with the pestle, she said. We'll make gruel and call it bread. We'll close the window with the blanket and say the wind is resting outside for once. When dusk settled, Liam and Dan tipped the last of the flour. Dust from their sleeves onto the table and laughed at themselves quietly, 2 ghosts shaking off the city. Maggie tied the green shawl a little higher and taught Aoife a rhyme she had purchased that afternoon for the price of carrying a stranger's bucket. 3 doors, 1 for sorrow, 2 for stew, 3 for bread if the list says you. Aoife missang it on purpose and made them all pretend to be annoyed so she could fix it and be proud. Baby John took the spoon at a pace that made time behave. His breath still had the map of fever in it, but the planets had moved a little closer to where they should be. Nora pressed her cheek to the top of his head and kept it there until the world matched their breathing. Later, when the children's shapes were smooth under blankets, Liam stood at the window and watched the market's corners fade to night. He thought about rules written by ink and rules enforced by fear and the 3rd kind that live in a city's habits. He thought of 1 spilled scoop and 100 decisions that sprouted from it. He thought of Sister Agnes in her doorway with a ladle held like a law. He thought of Seamus with a parcel for his wife and a hat he kept worrying because it was all he had left that fit. This place is built on lists, he said quietly, and on people who ignore them without making a mess of the world. Nora said from the bed, "That's how we're still here." He returned to the floor and lay on the side that still hurt, because sometimes pain is the only way to remind your body where its edges are. The house breathed. The market slept. Somewhere, a latch held. Somewhere else, a lock waited, smug as a full cupboard. Morning would ask for work, and the key would answer, maybe. The kitchen would write thin on its board, and then cross the word out and write it again. The workhouse would open its gate and swallow some portion of the city so it could keep living. The markets would wake and put on their brave faces ghosts, pretending to be shops. So children could remember what shops are dot, and in a warehouse not far from where the river bends. A man stood in his own doorway and weighed a kind of math that books don't keep property on one side of the scale, neighbors on the other, and wondered how much a door can hold before it remembers how to open. A priest's pocketbook, Father Donnelly kept 2 books. The first was the big parish ledger that sat on the vestry desk like a donations, baptisms, marriages, a column for candles and oil, a page for roof tiles that kept slipping. It smelled of old ink and beeswax and duties. The second was the pocketbook, small enough to disappear into a sleeve, soft-backed corners rounded by years of worry. It held the numbers he could not put in the big book, who had eaten, who had lied in order to eat, who had told the truth and still gone hungry, who had promised bread tomorrow and kept the promise or failed it. You could have read the city from that little book if you knew how to read the way Father Donnelly did between the figures, under the lines, in the places where ink thinned because a hand shook. Morning came to St. Patrick's, as it always did. Now, smoke thin in the aisle, benches warmer than the air, because people had sat and left their heat behind. A sheen of damp on the tiles where breath met stone. Sister Agnes moved like a bell through the kitchen door, sleeves rolled, face set on dew. The note she had nailed to the gate yesterday still hung there pot thin. Come slow, speak plain, but someone had added beneath it, in careful chalk, and mind your neighbors. Donnelly smiled at that addition and decided not to ask who wrote it. It was a better sermon than he had preached last Sunday. He opened the big ledger to a page the color of tea, and took a breath he held for a second too long. He wrote the date, and stopped, as if the pen might tell him what to do next. Then he closed the big book and drew out the pocket one, the way a man reaches for a tool he trusts. Burn, Francis St. he had written 3 days ago, under a column labeled simply soup. Infant, warm spoon, mother steady. He had drawn a small beside the name. Dots had meanings. This one meant watch closely, hope to be proved wrong. O'Shea, seam. Fish bench, no fish. Hands useful, pride intact. A tick beside that entry, the tick that meant ask for help on purpose. Make the ask an honor, not a mercy, Moira. Laundry hands. Strong voice, window tricks. A little cross, which in his code meant the one who keeps others from breaking. He shut the pocketbook and stepped into the yard where the line was already becoming itself. Tokens first, he called, not because he believed tokens were the making of justice, but because tokens were a kind of weather that kept the worst storms off for a while. He had carved a stamp from a potato with the cross of St. Patrick, and pressed it into red wax on the paper slips the night before. The wax made the tokens feel real to people who needed real things, and the potato was a joke, he told himself, to keep from crying. Father, Sister Agnes said, low, as the first ladle rang against the rim, we'll go to water by noon, and I'll not serve water, be warned. I'll lie as needed, he said, half under his breath. You will not, she said. Your lies sound like Latin. People can smell them. He didn't argue. He had learned to save his arguments for God. Confessions had shifted. Once, men had come to murmur about drink. about words said sharp to a wife, about a glance held too long at a girl's bright hair. Now they came with hunger tied to their tongues. A mother, I took a heel from a window basket left for the poor. He had wanted to ask then, who are you? But he had said, feed your children and return what you can when you can. A boy, I lied to the clerk about my age so the ship would take me. He had thought to speak of honor and instead had given the boy a blessing for a safe passage across a sea that owed him nothing. He heard too the confessions with no names spoken on benches, spoken to the air sins of survival that had become the city's liturgy. I hid my loaf. I told my neighbor a rumor so she would leave a line and make room for me. I kept the biggest spoon for my own. I pretended to be deaf to a child's cry for the first time in my life, and then remembered how to hear. Father Donnelly learned to listen without putting his hand to his heart each time a sentence felt like a wound. At 10, the baker from Nicholas Street came to the door, hat in hand, eyes hard because eyes must be hard when flour is short. Father, the list, he said. You've marked 7 families for night bread. I've floured for 5. Make it 8, Donnelly said, and heard how mad he sounded. Infants, he added, and one old man with no teeth who is still somehow working for others. 8. The baker repeated, flat. 1 more than I can do. So say the names and teach me which children sleep. Donnelly did not hesitate. Then give me 6 loaves and your broken ones, and I'll teach you the trick you want more than sleep. How to live with yourself in the morning. He smiled when he said it, and the baker nearly smiled back. Transactions had become confessions, and confessions had become transactions. It was not theology, it was Thursday. The butcher came next, his apron wiped with water, which meant he wanted to look clean more than he was. Bones, he said, are what I have. People want meat. But meat is not for now. Bones hold broth, Donnelly said. I have a pot. You have a bench by the door where you set aside too much for the cat. Give us the cat's portion. Let God feed the cat. He wrote Bones next to the butcher's name in the pocketbook, and drew a circle around it, which in his code meant you will come through if asked again. You are proud of yourself for this, and you should be. By noon the pot was thin, and Sister Agnes had adopted the voice she saved for storms. We stop, she told the line. You do not argue with a dry ladle. No one did, the line had learned. The sound of absolute how a pot announces its own end. Father Donnelly closed the yard and carried the empty kettle into the tiny sacristy. He took out the pocketbook again and stared at the dots and ticks and crosses until the page blurred. You are not a saint, he told himself, which was something he liked to say out loud, to hear how ungentle it sounded. He turned his collar down and walked into the nave, where the light found dust and made it holy. He knelt and pressed his forehead to the pew rail because it was cool. Lord, he said, very plain, because plain is how you speak to a friend who owes you nothing. We have a math that kills. I need a math that saves. If you send me bread, send also a way to divide it without making enemies of the hungry. If you send me nothing, send me the words to say when I'm empty, so I don't shame your name by speaking pretty. Silence replied. It was not unfriendly. It was the silence of a workshop where someone is thinking hard and does not want to be interrupted. He rose and found Maggie sweeping the sanctuary steps in patient squares, the way he'd asked. The girl had a face that grew older by inches each hour, and then, when Aoife missang and made her laugh, fell back into childhood in a rush, like a tide by a quick moon. You keep the steps very fine, he said. She shrugged, small and proud. Sister says if the place looks decent, people behave decent. I think she may be right. She often is, he said. How is your brother at the quay? Learning knots he can't tie on anything we own, she answered, with an edge that was not disrespect, but was very much the truth. He tied a rope around the bed leg and made it into a ship's rail so Aoife could be a captain. The bed leg complained. Aoife didn't. He wrote a line in the pocketbook. Maggie puts shine on steps, puts shine on words. He didn't know what the mark meant yet. It felt like the kind of ink that would one day tell him which door needed knocking so the girl could learn letters proper. Somewhere books were not luxuries. He closed the book before hope outpaced prudence. In the afternoon, a man with a livid hat stepped into the yard with his arms around a crate, as if the corners were trying to bite him. For the parish, he said, out of breath, from the Irish society across the water, the men who swing ropes, and the wives who keep them from dying. Letters went, money came, and then cod. He set the crate down. Salt smell leapt like a dog. Sister Agnes put both hands on the wood, as if it were a living thing. Fish, she said, and there was awe in the word. And hard biscuit. The man nodded. Well then, she said, with the authority of a general who has suddenly seen the flank open. We will soak the biscuit for the toothless and for infants. We will stew the fish with onion and turnip so it spreads itself like good gossip. She looked at Father Donnelly. Say your thanks, quick. Then carry, he said grace with a speed that would have disappointed his seminary professors and warmed St. Peter's heart. The crate split under a crowbar. The yard filled with a smell that reminded men of boats and women of feasts they'd stopped remembering on purpose. He tried to keep order and failed. He tried to measure and succeeded about half the time. He tried to make the lines behave and found they behaved themselves under Sister Agnes's eye better than under his. He retreated to the work he could do. Names, dots, ticks, in the middle of the fishwork. A familiar hat appeared. Seamus O'Shea, hands empty, face surprised by joy like a man who has been given back a tool he feared he'd lost forever. I can portion, he said, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. I know how to make a catch reach the last net. Sister Agnes handed him a knife without question. He cut fish to the size of hope. He showed two boys how to lay pieces, so they did not stick, and how to quick salt what would be held for morning. Work returned his shoulders to themselves. Toward evening, Father Donnelly carried a small parcel up Francis Street, not trusting any messenger with this one. He knocked on a certain door with a certain rhythm so not to wake the room's fear before its occupants. Nora opened, baby John. Clasped against her, as always, eyes traces of red where sleep should have been. Fish, he said, simply. Soft, and a prayer. Prayers don't soften bones, Nora said out of habit, and then remembered herself and smiled. But fish does. She took the paper and held it to her cheek, the way a person might welcome a letter from home. Come in, Father, she added. Sit a minute. You have the face of a man who wants to rest and hasn't scheduled it. He stepped in and saw the room as he had recorded it in shorthand on a page window patched with blanket. Bed made tight, children's. Shoes lined like soldiers, rope tied to the bed leg in a clove hitch that made him grin. Aye, he said, pointing. Your Dan has been at the Navy. Better a knot on a bed than a knot in a stomach, Liam said from the floor. His shoulder bruise had gone green-yellow, a saint's halo turned sour. "Father, thank you. For this, and for the way you look at people like they are not problems to be solved." He raised a hand. "The trick," he said, "is to look at them like they are me." He set a small folded paper on the table, and this, a token that is not a token, a baker's bread after closing 2 nights a week. He thinks he's buying my good opinion. I am, in fact, buying his soul a little air. "Are we to confess this?" Nora asked. "Not to me," he said. "To the baker, when he is old enough to wonder if he did anything right." He left before they could thank him in a way that would embarrass them all. On the steps, he met Moira with a bucket and a song under her breath. She looked at him in that keen way that women learn when they have watched men break under burdens. "You look thin in spirit," she said. "You should sit." "I will sit when sitting feeds a person," he said. But he knew she was right. Night wrapped the parish in its shawl. The city made its usual sounds boots on stone, a laugh that was cut short, a cart that should have been home already. Father Donnelly lit 2 candles at the side altar, as if starting a small fire others might warm their hands at. Then he opened the pocketbook and wrote a new line. "Liverpool gift, fish, biscuit. Miracles have schedules. We pretend we planned them." He added another, "Agnes, General, knife work, O'Shea, baker, 2 nights for the burns silent. Butcher, bones for soup, cat too fast 1 day." He put a dot beside his own name for honesty. Then he wrote a sentence he had never written before, and afterward felt less alone. Faith is sometimes a ledger, names in one column, needs in the other, and in the margin a grace you cannot account for but must spend anyway. He bent the book closed and pressed the cover with his thumb, the way a man seals a letter he is not sure he should send. After a while he stood and walked to the confessional, not because someone waited, but because sitting in that small wooden cave reminded him that listening is a kind of prayer. He closed his eyes and, for a few breaths, slept upright like a soldier. In a trench, he woke to a voice. Not God's. God rarely used the confessional for private conversation. This was the baker's wife, whispering through the lattice, her words neat as loaves set in a row. "Father, if I give yesterday's bread," she said, "am I a fool?" "You are a mathematician," he answered. "You have found a number. That saves more than it loses. And if my husband becomes proud of himself for it, then we will call it a miracle and write it down." He could hear her smile in the darkness. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. He waited until her footsteps faded, then took up the pocketbook one last time and drew a small star beside a single name. John, infant, color better, swallows in sips. Sunday rail avoided for now. He blew the candles and let the church settle into the sound of wood cooling. Outside, the city turned the page to another hard day. Inside, a priest with a ledger and a pocketbook, a nun with a ladle, and a fisherman with no fish but a knife stood between the hungry and the dark, not like walls of a Jezebot, like hands cupped around a small light on the other side of town. Lamps still glinted off a warehouse lock that did not yet know it would be asked a question in plain language. Whose food is this, truly? And in a building of stone where the air smelled of carbolic and resignation, a doctor turned down a corridor to a ward that was too full of children who did not cry anymore. Fever. Wards the Meath Hospital was a building that had learned to hold its breath. Stone that once promised order now carried a smell that never left vinegar. Boiled linen, coal smoke, stale sweat, and the thin, sweet wrongness of bodies losing the argument with fever. Above the door, A saint raised a hand in blessing that looked too small for the work. Dr. James Crawford had stopped checking his reflection in the window glass years ago. The window made liars of faces tired into older, worried into stern. He let his hands tell him who he was now, warm, steady, cracked a little where carbolic found knuckles. A doctor is a pair of hands with a mind attached. The mind can doubt. The hands mustn't. He entered the main hall at dawn with the same ritual as ever. Eyes left, eyes right, count the beds, count the cots on the floor where beds had multiplied. Into shadows, note the blankets that needed changing, the pails that needed emptying, the breaths that needed listening to before they became fire or stopped. Murphy, the porter, nodded once, the kind of nod that says, "You're here. I can breathe differently now," and handed over the night book. Crawford skimmed the ink with the speed of a man who reads for alarms, not poetry. 3 deaths in fever. 2, Murphy said, pressing a finger to the line as if he'd hoped force could change digits. 1 in dysentery. A girl moved to convalescent first in a week. The girl's name, Crawford asked. Kit, Murphy said, relieved to have. One answer that felt like a person and not a number. Catherine Doolin, 13. The nun with the small spectacles likes her. Nurse Bridget, Crawford said. Good. She finds ways to keep people tethered to the world. He closed the book. We'll start with Fever 2. Fever 2 was normally an echo of Fever 1, only warmer. These days it was a storm unto itself. The ward door swung and brought the heat to his face like a slap. 40 beds for 20 every corner, an invention. Windows cracked for air was stuffed back with cloth to keep the cold from killing what the heat had spared. At the far end, a small black board showed a stubborn list in chalk: sponging, broth, calamelnan, Lord Namuse sparingly, waterboy. Twice, under it, someone had added, in a neat, tiny hand, sing if you must. Cough into the sleeve. Nurse Bridget came at him, pencil tucked behind one ear, white cap, not quite white anymore. We've 10 new, she said, like a captain reporting weather. 3 with the rash, the rest with heat and head pain. One woman in her 7th month fevers, taken her strength, but the child still kicks. I made up barley water until the barley stopped cooperating. And spirits, he asked. At the pharmacy, she said. So dry he could have set tinder with it. In bottles that do not know our names. He moved bed to bed, the learned dance. Hand to the brow, eye to the tongue, ear to the chest. Question asked low so a person could lie without shame if the truth was too heavy. He wrote on a little slate at each bedside, because paper runs out and slates can be wiped when a miracle happens. At the 3rd bed, a boy stared up at him with pupils blown wide by heat. 10, 11. He had the look Dan sometimes wore when he tried to be older without enough years to fill the shape. A lice egg clung to a lash like snow. Crawford's own stomach, tightened one louse, can carry 1,000 soldiers of fever. What's your name? He asked. The boy's lips moved around dry. Tommy Doyle, he managed. Who brought you, Tommy? Crawford asked, sponging. The boy's wrist with water that had once been ice. Duh, he swallowed, said. Hold the line, said he'd be back. He's got 2 little ones, and Ma's gone too. The sentence walked off and never returned. He'll be back. Crawford lied expertly, the way men lie to children when the truth is a door with no handle. We'll cool you. You'll be sick for a stretch, and then you'll complain about the broth like a prince. That is my plan for you. He kept moving. A woman lay with a scarf knotted at her belly. eyes tracking the ceiling as if someone had written a message there she couldn't read. He set a hand low on the scarf and felt a foot press back into him, astonishingly alive. The mother's skin was furnace. Typhus had taken her appetite and her patience. The child still practiced being. "We'll sponge her," he told Nurse Bridget. "Small sips. If the pains start, send for me." He did not add, "We will choose which. Life to aim at if we must." Some sentences grow teeth if you speak them near people who already know what they mean. Near the window, a young man shivered the way people do when they are long past cold. The rash, that scattering of red stars that gave spotted fever. Its second name had bloomed over clavicle and belly. He watched Crawford, eyes bright with the terrible, lucid understanding fever sometimes gifts. "Doctor," he said, clear as a bell, "you can't get it from me today. I've given it to all I know already." "We'll pretend you're wrong," Crawford said gently. "It will help me do my work." He pressed 2 fingers under the man's jaw, feeling the drum of a heart working double in a body working half. There are moments when a diagnosis is a betrayal. You see too clearly and cannot lie to yourself. He adjusted the sheet as if neatness could argue with death. When the circuit was done, he met Bridget by the board. She had already written beside 4 names. "Attend twice each hour. Dysentery ward next," he said. Then the children. The dysentery ward had its own grammar. The rustle of straw that can't be clean, the wince men make when a cramp turns the belly into rope. The shame that salt and water finally soothe after words have failed. Crawford checked pulses, counted breaths, argued with a stubborn thirst that wants to kill people by asking for the very water that can't yet be given. "Boil it," he told the young orderly Matthew, who had the expression of a poet trapped in a body that wanted sleep. "Twice, then cool in covered tins. Tell them no until it's yes." Matthew nodded and set about the miser's work of saving lives, a spoonful at a time. Children's ward last, always last, because if he went there first he might be ruined for the rest of the morning. He pushed through the narrow door and the room stepped into him. Small coughs, big eyes, faces whose bones had decided to show themselves too early. A thin girl sat propped with pillows she did not need if the world were right. 13, Kit. He remembered the one who'd been moved to convalescent. She was here because convalescent had no convalescent left. She had hair in 2 braids, as if someone had decided to be hopeful and make a future for it. "Doctor," she said, polite in a way that would have been funny if it weren't a relic of a better life. "They say I am improving. I don't feel it yet, but I like the sound." "You're excellent at it," he said, inspecting the inside of her lower eyelid pink. "Not the pale that means the body has given up on making blood." "Good," he felt. A flare of something like joy, and wrote it down quick inside himself before it could be taken. At the crib, near the stove, a baby slept with his mouth open, breath coming like fast little stitches. Not John, another. There were so many. He had the belly of starvation and the limbs of winter. The nurse bent to test for heat. "Cooler," she murmured, "thank God." "Thank the woman who insisted we put his basket this close to the stove," Crawford said. God may take the compliment, but she plotted the physics. Nurse Bridget allowed herself a half smile. The woman was Sister Agnes. She threatened me with theology and then brought stew. I can be persuaded by either. A bell sounded somewhere for those who could keep it down, dosing for those who'd forget unless told, visiting hour for a handful with tokens in their fists. Visiting at the Meath was not the workhouse rail. There was a small grace here. Still, 1 hour was 1 hour. And afterward the doors closed, and you were yourself again. Patient or staff, no halfway at the receiving desk. The line had begun. People brought their sick at odd times now, because fever doesn't keep the city's schedule. A man with a cap in his hands and a face like a closed fist leaned in. "Doctor," he said, "the laundry said to bring my girl. She's been hot for 2 days and talking in ways that don't make sense. And she's never been like that. She's 12. He said 12, like it was both proof and a plea. "Name?" Crawford asked. "Doyle," the man said. "Patrick." The name hit the doctor's chest like a thrown weight. The boy in fever 2 to me was a Doyle. Dublin was a small place when fever shrank it to the size of a ward. "Bring her," Crawford said, the way a man invites lightning to a barn, and promises the roof will hold. They made space that wasn't there. In a hospital, space is faith. You make it and believe it will be enough. Nurse Bridget stripped a bed with the speed of a woman who can fold sheets into decisions. The girl came in, carried by her father. Her head rolled. The whites of her eyes showed. A rash had started along her ribs like bitter fruit. "We'll cool her," Crawford said again, hearing how thin the sentence had become from use. He sponged her wrists, her temples, the place where the pulse leaps at the ankle. He spoke steady nonsense. Stories about rain, about a river that waits its whole life to be one shade of green, about a dog that had come into the yard and refused to leave until given a biscuit. The girl turned her head and said something in the language of fever. He nodded as if he understood. The father leaned over the foot of the bed and did not blink. "Where's your boy?" Crawford asked, as gently as a question can be. "Tommy?" The name made the man's mouth tremble. "I brought him yesterday. You told him I'd be back. He's the good one with knots and a mouth on him." A watery smile broke through, unwelcome and beloved. "He'll bully this one into living. If I let him see her," the father said. "He's like that." "We'll try," Crawford said. 2 minutes, no more. Visiting rules are fences. Sometimes you open the gate and let the right animal through. He sent Murphy to fetch the boy. 10 minutes later, Tommy stood beside his sister's bed with a brow slick from his own heat and an expression that said, "I will not let you go first." "Brid," he whispered, "you're a nuisance. Wake up and argue with me." The girl sighed and then steadied, as if the reminder of trouble in the world gave her something to push against. 2 minutes. No more. He sent the boy back, wishing prayer and medicine were measured in the same units. Before noon turned to afternoon, the Liverpool crate's cousin arrived at the hospital saltfish and hard biscuit again, this time through a different door, the same rope of care stretching across water. The steward who delivered it looked like he had missed sleep to make the crossing quick. "For the wards," he said. "For God's name." He didn't ask for thanks, and Crawford didn't spend any. He spent the fish instead. Broth for the bellies that could hold it. Soaked biscuit for the toothless mouths that wanted to try, in the 1 hour that visitors were allowed. A familiar figure paused at the ward's threshold. Father Donnelly, collar undone, pocketbook put away, carrying instead to newspapers so old they were almost new again. "Stories," he said, by way of explanation to Nurse Bridget. "Pictures. Proof the world has other things in it besides rooms like this." He went bed to bed, saying what words can do when they are chosen. A joke that wasn't cruel, a sentence. About the weather that sounded like a promise it wouldn't always be inside air. A memory loaned from someone else's pocket for an hour. At Tommy's cot, He laid a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder and told him this. Your job is simple and impossible. Keep breathing. You're doing it beautifully. Father, Nurse Bridget said, catching him near the door, if you have a corner in that pocketbook of yours for a miracle, write down a request. We'd like 2 for the Doyle children, and 1 for the mother with the kicking baby. I'm fresh out of miracles I can command, he said. But I can pass along fish this morning, and a nun who scares men into behaving. I'll ask for 2 more. Make it 3, she said. 1 for yourself, he snorted softly. I'll take that under advisement. Afternoon. Dragged its feet. Fevers climb at dusk. They enjoy it, somehow. The ward's heat became a personality. Crawford kept moving because stopping meant hearing every cough, every whisper, every prayer. He sponged, he counted. He nodded men back from the edge with a look that said, you were seen when there was nothing else to give. At the worst of the hour, a sound like a bucket tipping came from the next room. The sudden silence after a fight breaks, and men remember they can breathe without shouting. Crawford recognized the silence, the way a sailor recognizes the smell of land. He glanced at Nurse Bridget. What now? His eyes asked. She cocked her head. The city, her look said. Always the city. Evening brought a thin relief. The woman's fever edged down a degree, barely measurable and everything. The child inside her kicked again, as if to say, I heard the story about the river. I'd like to see it. Tommy's pulse steadied between his own odd dreams. On the long table by the blackboard, 3 bowls stood with names chalked beneath them. Brid. Tommy. Mrs. Kearns to remind Hans where to carry Hope first. Crawford sat finally on a stool by the window and let the cool draft claim one side of his face. He opened his journal knot, a priest's pocketbook, not tied to anybody's soul. Just a list of days, and wrote what he could without telling the ward's secrets to the wrong ear. Fever 2nd week. Influx continues. Rash cases stable. Lining of gut unforgiving. Fish from Liverpool 2 crates in 10 days. Thank the rope. Sister Bridget invents time. Father D invents sentences. He paused and added a line he always pretended not to write. A child laughed at my joke about the river. That is a kind of medicine. When he looked up, the world had turned a shade dimmer. Murphy was trimming lamps with the care of a man who understood the value of a good wick. Outside, the street pulled on night, somewhere between here and the quay. A decision had been turning like a key in a pocket. He could feel it had changed in the city's pulse, the way a heart speeds before a shout. He closed the journal, stood, and walked the ward once more, the evening circuit. At Tommy's bed he placed his hand lightly on a burning forehead and spoke the sentence that had become both lie and discipline. You will live. Some people need the promise spoken, even when it has no legal standing. Sometimes the body takes it to court and wins anyway. By the door, Nurse Bridget blocked him playfully with her chin. Eat, she ordered. I'll not have you faint like an opera lady and frighten the children. Crawford accepted the bowl she pressed on him, half fish, half onion, the sum. More than the parts, and let heat move through him the way it had through the ward all day. Agnes says the parish has turned a corner, he offered. Corners aren't doors, Bridget said, but they keep us from walking off the map. He smiled despite himself. Who taught you to speak like that? He asked. You did, she said, walking up and down like a sermon with legs. He left the ward when the lamplight had finally learned its work and crossed the yard. In the corridor, a woman with a thin shawl waited at the edge of where visitors were allowed. hands working a rosary that had been handled into smoothness. She looked up as he passed. "Doctor," she asked, "does the fever take all at once?" "Not all," he said. "Not today." She nodded and went back to her beads, counting like a clerk, begging like a warrior. Night closed its hand over the hospital. Inside, breaths continued, some too fast, some too slow, one or two finally right. Outside, near the river, a man stood in a warehouse doorway with a key that felt heavier than iron and considered the equation he'd been avoiding. Law on one side, hunger on the other, and what a soul owes when numbers fail. Back on Francis Street, the burned door was shut. The patched blanket kept the worst of the air out. Nora lay with one hand on the baby's ribs, counting the small rise as if it were currency. Liam lay on his good side, eyes open, listening for any sound from the key that sounded like change. The city breathed, tired and stubborn. In the morning, a bell would ring that had nothing to do with a chapel, and a lock would remember what it meant to be a door. The warehouse keat wasn't a church bell that woke the key. It was the blunt iron clang from the Rivergater workman's alarm, the kind that says doors first, questions later. Men lifted their heads the way dogs do at a cart they know. Women judged the sound against a morning's list and chose which line to start in. Rain held back for once, hovering over the Liffey like a thought not yet spoken, on Merchant's Quay. Behind a strip of brick that had learned to look respectable, Aidan Keating turned a key in his pocket with his thumb, the way a man turns worry into shine. He had slept in the office again. Ledger for a pillow, conscience for a blanket. The ledger had neat columns and good penmanship, consignments to Liverpool and Bristol, weights and dates, the thin, careful script of his clerk, Mr. Pritchard. The conscience had sloppy handwriting and kept smudging the sums. Keating wasn't a villain. He was a grain factor with a back that had learned stairs and a mind that liked a tidy page. He'd inherited the business from a father who had spoken about profit the way other men speak about salvation. Keep it clean, keep it certain, keep it coming. The old man had died before the blight. Lucky men die before history arrives. From his office window, Aidan could see the river, the dock gate. And if he leaned hard to the left the door of St. Patrick's Yard, where Sister Annis's white cap moved like a small flag against weather. Yesterday he had watched her hold a market with nothing but a ladle and a voice. He had watched, too, the way the crowd's hunger pressed at the edges of rules, and how those edges held because a handful of people, none priest, to constables. Learning not to be afraid, one dockman with a steady hand fused to let it split. He had also watched a girl faint with an infant, bent like a question mark on her shoulder, and had done nothing but grip the sill until his knuckles whitened. Doing nothing is a kind of action, he told himself. The ledger had numbers to prove a different duty. A cough in the hall. Pritchard, pale as unbaked dough, with collars too starched to be comfortable. "Sir," he said, without entering fully, as if the room itself might take offence. "Bristol's man sent word at dawn. The Annabelle sails this evening. He expects the last of Henderson's consignment, 200 stone. Constable Kavanagh's men will escort the wagon. You need not concern yourself with I. Concern myself with everything that leaves through my door," Keating said. It came out sharper than he meant. What of the other consignment? The small lots McLaughlin's and Baird's and the two for Castle Street. Paid, Pritchard said, and something that might have been relief or fear passed across his face and collected. "We have only Henderson's and the Merchant Oats, bound for Liverpool and Dublin. Keating asked, the unbusinesslike question he had sworn not to say out loud. Pritchard looked at the ledger as if it might answer. Dublin, he said gently, doesn't have a column. Down in the yard, the watchman Doyle, a man with hands like paddles and a habit of whistling through his teeth, tightened the chain on the big door, because tightening was what he did when anything felt uncertain. Keating watched the padlock flash once in the new light. The shine made him angry. He put the key on the desk and turned it with his finger, the way a father turns a coin in a pocket at a racecourse and tries not to bet, sir. Pritchard said. Keating picked up the ledger and set it down again. He imagined the page as a set of scales law on one side, hunger on the other. He imagined which side had teeth. The law had police and paper and men who spoke crisply. Hunger had children who did not cry anymore because crying wastes strength. He tried to weigh them and found he did not trust the weights. He didn't decide. The decision arrived in him the way a tide arrives there, and then suddenly, everywhere, Doyle. He called down the stairwell, loud enough to make the watchman stop whistling. Open the big door. The yard took a breath. Sir, open the door, Keating repeated, and send Eileen a boy with a note that says, lock the house. Keep Neil inside. Leave the upstairs window and don't come. He wrote it. Fast. A hand that had signed receipts all his life, proving it could write an order to his own wife without shaking. Pritchard stood very still, as if the room were a ship and he needed to keep his balance. Sir, he said again, softly this time, like a man at a wake. Henderson is in London, Keating said, too quickly, because saying a man's distance out loud is the same as making him harmless. Doyle, he shouted. Again, the lock. The click of iron turning was smaller than it should have been, considering what it meant. Locks are proud until they're asked to be doors. Smell moved first grain. Dry and clean. An honest scent that made the yard feel like a summer barn for one reckless heartbeat. Then sight, canvas ranks, the pale gold that made people's mouths. Water for reasons half in the tongue and half in the memory. Doyle swung the second door and the light made dust visible. A private world stirring. Word behaved as it always does in a city it ran. A woman at the pump saw the door and sent a thought running down Bride Street faster than feet. A boy on the quay read a watchman's gesture and made a new route for his errands that took him past the parish and up Corn Market, tossing the news like bread. Keating's door is open. They didn't come like a surge. They came like a promise kept cautiously. The first were people who had watched that door for weeks without admitting it to themselves. Women with infants, men with the particular shame that comes from being strong and empty, girls who had learnt to plant themselves like posts. Sister Agnes arrived not because she had heard a bell, but because she had grown a sense for where rope needed throwing. Father Donnelly came with his collar down and his pocketbook absent on purpose. Sean drifted in beside Liam the way a mass drifts into a sailor's eye, always there, even when you try not to look. Moira stood at the edge and measured danger. With the speed of a laundress counting stains, Constable Kavanagh appeared at the top of the lane like a man who has been sent to keep peace and would like a definition. Behind him, the younger constable, the one who had learned how to lower his baton without losing his nerve, took in the open door and made a small, hopeful sound before he stopped himself. Pritchard put both hands on the scale table. Sir, he said in a last attempt at order, if you give in measures, and write them if only to show measures, Sister Agnes said, catching the word and turning it into law. Good, we'll do measures. She snagged a piece of chalk from somewhere inside her sleeve and wrote on the brick beside the door in a surgeon's hand, "Infants and sick first, old next, 1/2 stone each, bags ready, stand in lines, do not shame yourself." Underneath she added, "Smaller, constables, keep your sticks low." Kavanagh read the last line and snorted, which for him was consent. "All right then," he said to the younger man. "You watch the sides, I'll watch the front. Anyone pushes gets my boot to their pride, not their head." "Mr. Keating," Father Donnelly said, stepping in close, the way a friend does. "At a cliff's edge, it's not enough to open. You must own the line or it will own you." "I'm learning," Keating said. The words tasted like humility and fear. He rolled back the top canvas, lifted the first sack with Doyle weight turning shoulders into prey-rand, set it on the scale. He took the knife, cut tidy, and let a thin stream of wheat run into the measure, a 1/2 stone scoop, honest and exact. "Names," he said to Pritchard, without looking. "Streets, write them. Let a man see himself accounted for." "Paper," Pritchard whispered, already working, his hands finding their native home. A woman stepped forward, a girl woman, really, with an infant so new his hair was still wondering what to be. Her shawl was stiff with yesterday's rain. She held out a bag that had been a pillowcase. "For him," she said, and tried to keep her voice from cracking in a place where pride had been tenderized too often. "For all of you, Sister Agnes." Corrected, not unkindly, name. Mary Quinn, Old Kilmainham Road. The babies, her throat jumped. "Paddy, Mary Quinn," Pritchard said, writing like a man carving a name into a pew. Keating leveled the scoop, did not cheat the measure in either direction, and poured the grain into Mary's bag. The sound it made was its own liturgy. Mary closed both hands on the cloth, and for a second her face lost the rigid smarter than her years look and became simply human. The line learned itself. Women with infants made a first rank. Moira stood sideways and used her elbows more gently than a man would. Sean and Liam stationed themselves at the table, one each side of the scale, Sean watching for danger like a sailor reading a sky. Liam steadying the bag mouths with a patience he had cultivated in fatherhood and learned to apply to everything. Dan took a station by Doyle to stack empties and learn the names of knots other than clove and half-hitch. The younger constable yanked a barrel from the corner and set it as a second table without being told. "You'll need a place for the old," he said to no one. As if this had always been obvious to him. Trouble tried, because trouble always tries where hunger lives. A man with hollow cheeks and a cart driver's shoulders edged along the side made a mean little calculation about how close he could come without being seen, and reached for the cut mouth of a sack. Sean's hand found his wrist mid-air, not hard enough to shame, not soft enough to be mistaken. "Don't do the thing you'll despise yourself for," he said, as if reminding the man of his own biography. The man blinked and stepped back, into his place. The line closed around the moment and hid it for him. Half-stone after half-stone, chalk on brick turned into a habit. Keating measured, Pritchard wrote, Doyle hoisted. Sister Agnes decided. The constables held their sticks lower than their instincts. Father Donnelly moved like oil on troubled water, smoothing small ripples with sentences. A girl with white fingers and a private cough kit. No, this one had both braids loose and too much bravado, miscounted her place and found herself at the front too soon. Moira put a flat palm to the girl's shoulder and guided her back, then slipped a pinch into the girl's pocket without asking permission from law or God. Liam saw 3 faces he knew from the parish line, and 2 he knew from the hospital doorway, and 1 he had only known from the edges of rooms. Mr. Walsh, the schoolman who had stopped teaching because children had stopped arriving. Walsh took his measure and kept his eyes on the scale, as if counting the grains might keep his mind from counting the minutes of the day. "Thank you," he said, "to the measure itself, because sometimes gratitude avoids faces it couldn't." Last clean. 2 hours in, when the yard had swept its first crowd into smaller ones, a coach took the corner with the kind of certainty only a rich man's axle can manage. The horse's harness brasses bounced like coins. A man stepped down in a coat that kept rain off because money refuses to let water show it any disrespect. Mr. Henderson's agent Pritchard's letters had given him a name. Mr. Baines looked at the open door and turned a colour between outrage and accountancy. "Mr. Keating," he said, in a voice trained to be heard across rooms smaller than the city, "you are distributing property that does not belong to you." "I'm distributing food," Keating said, not loudly, but the yard heard. He didn't add, "that does not belong to me either." He didn't have time to be clever. "It is the same thing," Baines said. He gestured at Kavanagh. "Sergeant, arrest this man. There are writs in the coach. You'll be commended." Kavanagh did not move. He considered the brick, where chalk had made more sense than any writ he had served all winter. He considered the women with infants first, old next. 1/2 stone each. The order had won him an hour's quiet in the yard and 3 fewer fights than an ordinary day. He considered the boy stacking sacks, who was watching him with a mouth set like a dare. He considered the nun. "I see law," Kavanagh said at last, "and I see order, and they're not always kin. You want this man arrested. You walk him through that crowd yourself, Mr. Baines. If they let you, I'll write your commendation in my best hand." A ripple moved through the yard, not a cheer, because cheering is for festivals. Relief, maybe, or a recognition that the day had decided which way to lean. Baines looked at the faces, at the sticks not raised, at the chalk law that had beat his paper law, and at a reality he did not know how to quantify. He was not brave. He was not a fool. He lifted his chin in a swap for dignity. "I'll be back with the sheriff," he said, which was both a promise and a retreat. "Bring your best handwriting," Sister Agnes said without looking up. "We'll give it a 1/2 stone." Keating's hand started to shake only after Baines's Bouthiels had gone. He measured wrong Heavycourt himself, corrected. Pritchard did not correct him aloud. He merely wrote, "Quinn, Mary, Old Kilmainham, infant." £8 in a script so neat it could have been engraved. Toward afternoon, the sacks went from ranks to stragglers. The last one sat on the table like a child out after curfew. Keating ran his palm over it and felt the knot in the canvas. He looked up. The yard had thinned to people who had come late because shame travels slower than need. He cut the mouth and did not weigh, not because he had become careless, but because the scale had earned a rest. "Last 9, Sister Agnes called. If you've come this far, you've already done something brave." They came, 9 separate stories pretending to be a line. A widow who had given her bread ticket to her neighbor yesterday and regretted it in the night. An apprentice who'd kept work by stealing nails and giving them back. Which wasn't theft, he explained, just inventory confusion. A boy with a yellow scarf, the grain thief from Corn Market, older by a week, with his sister's hand at his sleeve. Keating poured. The bag mouths opened and closed like lungs. The very last measure went to a man who had waited until everyone else had finished waiting. Seamus, oh she, hat in his hands again, stubborn pride in his mouth. "I've no infant," he said, almost apologizing. "You have a town," Sister Agnes answered. "It counts." Keating turned the sack upside down and shook, a foolish, generous gesture that yielded 3 more handfuls. Seamus smiled with half his face. "Pans can be taught," he murmured, and nodded to Liam without saying why. When the bag tops were tied, when the chalk had flaked to a white smear on brick, when the yard had more footprints than grains left on its stones, quiet arrived. The kind of quiet that comes after work that mattered. Keating leaned both hands on the table and let the ache find him. Doyle took off his cap for the first time all day, looked at the empty door as if expecting it to congratulate him, and found it uninterested. Pritchard put down his pen and stared at his hands the way a man looks at a tool that is surprised him. Father Donnelly stepped near and laid a hand on Keating's sleeve. "You've bought 3 hours," he said. "It's not the world. It's 3 hours. They will sleep, some of them, instead of stare. That is a currency God accepts." "I've bought a summons," Keating said, looking at the street where Baines had disappeared. "Henderson will carve my name out of his patience with a knife. Then we'll pay with names," the priest said. "If they come to take your door, they will have to knock at 100. Across the river, a bell from the Meath counted 2 o'clock. In a room that smelled of boiled linen and stubborn life, a girl named Brid stirred, and a baby near the stove remembered how to swallow without thinking. In St. Patrick's Yard, the fish stew stretched 1 more ladle than it should have, because Seamus cut the pieces fine, and Sister Agnes looked at the pot as if looking could add broth. At Francis Street, Nora pressed the back of her hand to baby John's cheek and felt something she had not felt in days. The cool of a child not at war with his own heat. She looked at Maggie and didn't say the thing she didn't dare say. "He may live." She said instead, "We'll grind the grain gentle and feed him with a spoon, little and often." Liam nodded, because his mouth had other business breathing, and not crying in front of the children. Doyle slid the big doors shut again. The padlock clicked. It sounded different, now less proud. Locks that have worked as doors once are never quite as arrogant after. Kavanagh rolled his shoulders. "All right," he told the younger constable. "We'll walk the lane. If Baines returns with a sheriff, we'll see how tall his paper is against a yard of people who've eaten." The younger man nodded, and for a second his face lost the boy and kept the man. Keating sat on the edge of the empty scale and waited for the ache in his legs to stop translating itself into fear. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, "I wrote the names twice." He held up 2 sheets, identical, ink still shining. "One for the parish, one for your wife, in case a man knocks with a loud voice and you are not home." Keating, who rarely blessed anyone out loud, blessed him. "Go home," Sister Agnes ordered, as if he worked for her, which today he had. "Tell Eileen the city remembered what a door is for. Then find a way to sleep that does not involve feeling clever." She wiped chalk from her fingers onto her skirt and smiled. The smallest smile he had seen all winter. "We'll need you again." He stood. His knees argued and lost. He buttoned his coat, which had forgotten how to fit him in the last 3 hours. He took one last look at the door-only wood and iron-hand, nodded to it as if to a person who'd behaved well when no one expected it. On the way out he passed Father Donnelly, who had his collar up and his eyes on the weather. "Mr. Keating," the priest said, "today you've done something that will grow larger when told. That's how the city pays its debts when it has no money." Keating almost laughed. "Stories won't keep me out of court," he said. "No." The priest agreed. "But they will fill the room." Evening gathered itself from the edges of roofs. The river took on that pewter color that makes you think of spoons and soup. In the hospital, Dr. Crawford finished his round and wrote a single line. City's pulse quickened at 2. Fever broke in 2 children unaccountably. He didn't draw a line between the events. He didn't have to. On Francis Street, Dan practiced his knots with a length of twine that had tied a grain sack, and Aoife watched the grains soaking in the cup, how they swelled, how they softened, and decided she liked food that grew before. You ate it because it meant nothing had been taken away. Night would bring Baines with paper and a higher voice. Morning would bring men with questions about law and words like theft and riot. But today ended with bowls rinsed and children drowsy, and a door that had chosen to be a door. Law and mercy by morning. The chalk on Keating's wall had gone pale as the sun, but still readable if you knew what to look for. Infants and sick first, old next. Old next, 1 half-stone each. The letters had gotten into the brick's pores, the way certain sentences do once a city breathes them. Mr. Baines returned with paper and a man to carry it. He came not in a hurry outrage, likes a measured pace, but with a small parade of authority. A sheriff's officer in a dark coat, 2 clerks whose pens had the cautiousness of men who understand the price of ink, and a boy to hold the pasteboard box where writs sleep until woken. The younger constable saw them first and shifted his weight the way a sailor braces for the ship to change mind. Sergeant Kavanagh said nothing. He only adjusted his hat so his eyes were in shade. It's a trick men use when they prefer to choose what to see. Aidan Keating had told his wife, Eileen, everything the night before, each scoop, each name, the way the lock had sounded when it behaved like a door. She'd listened with her hand over her mouth and then lowered it and said, in the way women say the most radical things, good. Then we are poor with purpose. He stood in the yard now, without a hat first mistake, the kind that announces you as a man not hiding behind anything, and waited for paper to speak. Double quotes, Mr. Keating. Baines's voice tried to be a bell. By authority of this writ, you are required to appear before the magistrate on the charge of theft, conversion of property, and riot in a place of business. Riot, Sister Agnes asked from the doorway, dry as salt. When a yard lines itself and leaves cleaner than it arrived, we call that a kitchen. The sheriff's officer glanced at the nun with the professional unease of a man who knows uniforms but not habits. We'll keep to business, he said, as if speaking to a room that had not overheard half his life already. Keating could have made speeches. He could have said the things that feel good in the throat and do nothing in the world. Necessity, neighbors, you sleep easier with a full stomach. He pictured his father's face, skeptical of rhetoric, loyal to coins, and swallowed. Instead, I'll come, he said, simple. And I'll come without the yard. He looked at Kavanagh and the younger constable as he spoke, a promise not to draft them into anyone's army. He did not look at the people in the lane. Trust is sometimes the art of not calling witnesses. To o'clock, the officer said. Richmond Courthouse. Father Donnelly stepped forward, collar askew, pocketbook deliberately left behind. He won't walk alone, he said. I am fond of bad math. I propose to bring a kind that will confuse your clerk to weeping names. He tipped his head toward Pritchard. Make 2 copies. Pritchard had, of course. He lifted to neat stacks and tapped them into straightness against his palm. 1 for the court, he said softly. 1 for the parish. He did not add a third sentence on, one for Eileen to put under a board in case the roof falls, because it felt like saying a woman's private vow out loud. They went without ceremony. Eileen tied a scarf and put her hand in her husband's for the length of one doorway, and then let go as if blessing him were a practical act. Doyle, the watchman, shut the warehouse with the gravity of a man who had decided to be loyal to doors no matter how they behaved. Sister Agnes wiped the chalk from her fingers onto her skirt and murmured to the younger constable, "Sticks low," as if she were assigning him to carry a sacrament. The courthouse had rooms that smelled like dust, taught to stand straight. Portraits of men who had never known hunger watched from gold frames and did not blink. The clerk looked up when the party entered and made a small face as if he'd tasted too much caraway in the bread. He had the docket already, Henderson v. Keating, written in a hand that wanted to be elegant and was merely thin. The magistrate O'Byrne, a Dublin man with English cuffed, the bench with the careful neutrality of somebody who would prefer a quiet afternoon. He had lived his life between ledger and parish, which makes a person a certain shape. He nodded to Baines, whose coat buttons seemed to swell with righteousness, then to the sheriff's officer, then to Keating, and, finally unexpectedly, to Sister Agnes and Father Donnelly, who had taken the front bench as if pews translated. Across buildings, let's keep our voices. O'Byrne said, a good opening for days when voices wanted to run wild. Mr. Baines rose like a man in a painting and read from paper. Words like property, obligation, consignment, willful. He spoke of schedules and ships, the Annabelle waiting with her hold, expecting wheat like a guest who has been promised a roast. He spoke of law, the thick ink kind that makes men sure of themselves. When he was done, the magistrate made a small mark with his pencil, neither approval nor scorn, just a notation one makes beside a sum that adds. Mr. Keating stood with his hands unclenched by an act of will. I opened my door, he said. No embroidery. I measured grain to those who hadn't a day to wait for lists and fees. I wrote their names, he nodded at Pritchard's copies, so that if a man wants to quarrel in an orderly fashion, he can quarrel with a ledger as well as with me. Did you know, Baines cut in, too quick, that the grain was Mr. Henderson's? Keating said. I knew it was his by paper. I knew it was Dublin's by hunger. There's a sound rooms make when a sentence gets in. O'Byrne's pencil paused. Kavanagh, who had come in to stand by the door like a piece of furniture, with opinions, looked at the floor to keep his mouth from showing. The younger constable did not know what to do with his eyes and let them rest on the magistrate's hands. Hands tell you more truth than faces. Father Donnelly rose no flourish, just knees and then words. Your worship, the yard was not a riot. I've heard riots. Riots have a music, and it's ugly. Yesterday had a rhythm, the steady scrape of measure on sack, the small sob when a bag fills, the sound a nun makes when order stands up inside her and begins to shout polite instructions. He held up Pritchard's list, names and weights. If theft, then theft weighed honestly. Sister Agnes did not rise. She spoke from the bench, which is its own kind of defiance. If you fine him, she said, tell us the price by day's end. We'll pay it in loaves, and you can tell your children they ate law. A ripple moved along the back benches. Even portraits grew curious. The magistrate cleared his throat the way a man does when laughter is about to make him unfit for office. He leaned forward. Mr. Keating, do you propose to repay Mr. Henderson the value of his grain? I propose. To try, Keating said. I propose to make a book like his that counts my debt and let men see it grow smaller or larger according to my honor. Fine words, Baines muttered. Harder than yours, Pritchard said under his breath. Shocking. Himself. His ears went red. He stayed standing. Oban drummed 2 fingers, once, twice. Mr. Baines, he said, you have the law at your back. It is a fine back to have. You may press for full remedy and see if Dublin gives you a rope or a ribbon. For your trouble, or he let the word sit like a coin on the table. You may accept a bond. Baines's mouth made a purse shape. A bond written by who? Paid with what? By Mr. Keating, the magistrate said. Secured by his business, and he turned his pencil point toward the parish pew by the parish's good sense, which appears to be a currency I cannot ignore today. He faced the room. Here is my math. The court will assess a fine. For disorder, he held up a hand when Sister Agnes drew breath. Because if I call it nothing, I invite every warehouse to turn into a kitchen. £5, due in 14 days. Mr. Keating will sign a bond to Mr. Henderson for the value of the stock used, payable over 12 months in monthly sums. With this list, he tapped Pritchard's neat columns as his ledger of claim. If he fails, we will consider sterner remedies. If Mr. Henderson refuses the bond, he may bring the case again and I will hear it. But I warn him that my patience will have learned very little new by then. Law had spoken without using its loudest voice. Mercy had not dressed itself as charity. It had put on a clerk's coat and learned to use a pencil. Baines sputtered because sputtering was the only language left that might sound like victory. This is irregular, he said. It is Dublin, O'Byrne answered, which felt like a definition. They wrote papers. Keating signed with a hand, steadier than his legs. Pritchard stood at his shoulder, a man who had learned he could be brave by accident. Father Donnelly produced a small bag of coins coppers gone smooth from years of fingers, silvers with nicks, a gold that had known 3 weddings and 2 births, and set it on the rail. Toward the 5, he murmured, collected last night. I told them it was for candles. Sister Agnes opened her reticule and took out a twist of paper. Inside lay 6 shillings, a thimble, and a locket with a lock of hair. The thimble is a promise, she said. The locket we are not spending. The shillings are actual. She looked at Baines while saying it and made the coins sound like scripture. From the door, Kavanagh coughed. Not a warning, a contribution. He and the younger constable placed 2 small packets on the clerk's table, half a week's wages between them. For order, he said, before anybody could accuse him of kindness. By the time the bond had been sanded and the receipts folded, the £5 had nearly found themselves. The clerk counted twice and looked surprised at what the column did when people put their little on one side of the scale. Sir, Baines told the magistrate tightly, Mr. Henderson will appeal. He has friends with longer tables. Then, I will fetch a longer pencil, Oban said, weary. Do as you think best. In the meantime, let Dublin digest yesterday. A city behaves differently when it has eaten. Outside, the cold had sharpened. The river looked like a blade laid flat and waiting to be picked up. On the steps, people had gathered without clustering. Hunger teaches you how not to press unless you must. When Keating emerged, a murmur rose the way wind moves through reeds. Not cheering cheers are for victories that run fast, but something like a city, exhaling. Eileen took his arm and did not ask the question she didn't want answered. Instead, she said, we have a fine to pay, and I have 2 rings that can become flour. He shook his head, and she said, "We'll discuss it when you're not being heroic." Moira came forward with the calm of a woman who knows how to get a stain out of anything. "We'll collect," she told Sister Agnes. "Every window I've mended owes me a penny." I didn't say it then. I'll say it now. Sean looked at Kavanagh with a new degree of familiarity. "Sergeant," he said, "you can come drink a tea at our fire any time you like. It's not beer, but it's warm." Kavanagh grunted, in a way that meant I might, and the younger constable looked at his boots, because his face had ideas of its own. Back at St. Patrick's, Father Donnelly opened the big ledger for the first time that week with something like pleasure. He wrote a line under a clear date. "Fine paid, nearly parish to settle remainder." Bond signed. Law and Mercy shook hands, did not kiss. Then he took out the pocketbook and wrote smaller truths, names as shield. Pritchard discovered spine. Kavanagh chose order over paper. Younger constable, teachable, Baines. A man who has not yet learned hunger's grammar, not illiterate in a language we now speak. At the Meath, Dr. Crawford finished dosing and sat on a stool he trusted. Nurse Bridget came with the news. Bond, Fine and he let himself close his eyes for one grateful minute. "It will keep me from writing 'A city that eats is a better patient' in the journal as if it were a medical insight," he said. "But that is what I want to write." "Write it," she said. "Then draw a little fish beside it, for the rope from Liverpool." In the burn room, Maggie read the chalk, ghosts on her own walled away light, finds old writing and made. A copy on brown paper for Dan, who liked to keep rules handy when he was trying to bend them. Responsibly, Nora fed baby John with the soft patience that had become a habit. His swallow came like a metronome that had been wound properly. She pressed her cheek to his hair and whispered, "Nothing, no petitions this time, just the sound a mother makes when a body in her arms has chosen to move." Toward living. Evening. Found Keating on a chair by his office table with the Bond in front of him and a cup of tea that had cooled twice. Eileen took the paper, folded it, and slid it under the ledger. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go on." He nodded, and in the little movement was everything feared that wasn't cowardice, pride that wasn't foolishness, and a strange, clean tiredness that sometimes follows a right decision. He looked at the door that had learned to be a door and felt the new arrogance gone from the lock. He set the key on the table and left it there like a promise not to hide keys in pockets anymore. Night gathered itself up and put on its dark coat. The river whispered its old stories and learned a new one. Somewhere up the quays, a bustle of rope and curses said a ship was making ready. Men's names already on lists, girls' shawls folded into bundles. A priest's hand reached for an ink that blesses departures as if they were births. The city would try to keep its children. The sea would ask for some of them anyway. The Coffin. The ship had a pretty name and an ugly purpose. That's how the sea sells itself blue on the surface, trouble in its pockets. At dawn she lay in the river like a patient thing, two masts against a winter sky, tar shining in seams, her rigging drawn neat as a clerk's handwriting. Somebody with a poet for a mother had painted the letters on her stern. Sarah Ann, the key read the name and said a different word aloud. Coffin, because Dublin had learned to call things by their hungriest names. Tickets were not paper so much as decisions hardened into ink. A man in a little office with windows that didn't open sold them. He had a ledger like Keating's columns and dates, and a way of saying next that kept his mouth from feeling the weight of what came after. Behind him, a lithograph showed a smiling family on a sunny deck, as if the Atlantic were a lake with good manners. The picture had never met wind. Moira's niece, Kathleen, stood at that counter with her jaw set the way women set cake batter. When flour is dear, this will come right, because I say so. She had 2 small boys, a trunk that had been ambitious when new and now only honest, and a linen bag with the last of her mother's buttons. You never know when a button is the difference between pride and shame. Boston, she told the agent, as if the word itself had agreed to meet her at the wharf. 2 children under 10. The agent scanned the boys like a coachman scans. A load-weight balance, how close to breaking. Steerage, he said, which was a sentence and a sentence served. Berths assigned on embarkation. Water allotted daily. No fire galley only. Doctor aboard. 6 to 8 weeks depending on wind and God. We've 2 pennies for wind, Moira said, standing at her niece's shoulder like a wall that knows how to bend. God owes us change. £4. For the lot, the agent said. He didn't look apologetic. Apologies waste time. You can work the crossing, cleaning, cooking, washing, dead sheets for reduction. Kathleen signed with a hand that had learnt letters at a parish school before famine turned the alphabet into a luxury. Her boys stared at the drawing of the smiling family and then at the grey window where the river wore a face they recognized. We'll be that, the older whispered to the younger, and said it bravely enough that the lie tried on honesty and almost fit. News travels like water in a city, downhill, fast, and into every low place. Word of the Sarah Ann's loading reached Francis Street by breakfast. Liam heard it in the stairwell, 2 men arguing softly about whether it's better to drown where no one you love can see you, or starve where everyone you love keeps count. He went inside and told Nora without drama. Moira's niece means to go, he said. Today or tomorrow. The tide's with her. Nora looked at baby John's coloured a good pink, making a cautious comeback hand. Then at Maggie, who had been practicing brave since autumn and might want a new thing to practice. We'll walk them, she said. A family should cross a city with a wall on either side. They went as they went everywhere now. Dan with the cart, because a cart makes you look like you've planned something, and plans change how other people see you. Maggie with Aoife's hand in her pocket, not because Aoife would run, but because pockets are how sisters make promises without words. Sean came too, a matter-of-fact miracle. He said he was going to the quay anyway to ask after day work. He did not say he was going, because no one should face a gangplank alone. Down by the river, the Sarah Ann's world had already begun. A rope ladder hung from her side like a dare. Men in caps called numbers that were not numbers anyone cared about. They were just sounds to stitch the morning together. A bosun, with a voice like a drawer slammed shut, shouted "Mind your head" at anyone whose hope had made them taller than the beam allowed. The dock smelled of salt, tar, and onions fried too long in fish fat. Everything ships promise, and everything they forget. Kavanagh and the younger constable were there, not to keep people out, but to keep the crush from pressing a woman and her baby into a shape the sea would not recognize. The sergeant's stick hung like an afterthought. "Lines," he called. "If the ship sees you look like a crowd, she'll treat you like freight. Stand like people." The younger man picked up a bundle for a widow without asking her permission to help. The gesture had learned humility since Cornmarket. Father Donnelly came with his collar straight and a tin of holy water that had been diluted twice and still felt like water. He didn't bless the ships don't need your kindness. But he blessed hands, the captain's. because command without humility is a recipe. The gangplank's keeper, because anyone who says now and not yet all day requires forgiveness. The children's, always the children's. He kept the pocket book in his inner coat today and wrote one line while nobody looked. Departures are liturgies with no homily allowed. Then he put the little book away because no man should watch too closely while hearts break neatly. Dr. Crawford had been asked by the board to glance at bodies before they crossed into the ship's jurisdiction, which is to say out of anyone's. He didn't approve, he also didn't refuse. He checked tongues, felt pulses, listened at ribs with an ear that had learned how to not take insult from secrets. Fit enough, he told a dozen. 2-3, he said, not 2 day, and took their curses without flinching. A day's waiting is not your enemy, he told a father with a boy who had that glassy fever look that says 2 nights will decide me. The ocean can wait, death will not. The man blinked like someone woken sharply and turned back home, swearing he'd never speak of this mercy. At the foot of the gangplank, the agent became a priest of another church. Tickets checked. Names matched to a list that said nothing about character, courage, or whether the person holding the paper could tell a story that would save lives later. Quinn, Mary, he called. And Mary, with baby Paddy, the one who'd first received Keating's grain, stepped up with her mouth thin and her back promising the ship it would break before she would. O'Rourke, Kathleen, 2 boys. Moira kissed each boy hard, 1 ear, 1 forehead, 1 back of neck. That way, no matter which way they turned on the ocean, they'd bump into love. If the wind misbehaves, she told the captain as if he were a domestic servant, I'll have words waiting on the quay when you return. The Captain Hale, with eyes that had forgotten softness to keep seeing weather, touched his hat. Ma'am, he said, and meant it. Inside the Sarah Ann, steerage smelled of new wood and old decisions. The bunks came in stacks 3 high, narrow as grudges. A corridor ran between like a throat. A man had chalked rules on a plank, nitrogen monoxide lamp in berth. No fire galley only. No spirits. Small voices after 9. Wash tins after mess. Sick to the lee side. Under the last, some hand had added, sing if you must. The galley was a box with a heat in it. A pot big enough to baptize a cow hung on a hook. Another waited on a shelf, with onion skins remembering better days. Hard biscuit in a barrel, the kind that breaks teeth if it doesn't soak, the kind sailors knock weevils out of with jokes they don't tell children. A cask with water wore a tap like a deputy. A chart near it tallied rations in a math that starved slowly on purpose, so many pints per head per day, unless the wind says otherwise. A woman in a cap too fine for this voyage, but worn anyway for spine Mrs. Byrne, unrelated to our Burns, took a slate and began a list of who would ladle when. If we leave it to the men, she said to Sister Agnes, who had somehow gotten herself below deck, though she clearly had no ticket, we'll eat twice and then wonder where the food went. Agnes approved the list with a look and climbed back up before the captain noticed and had to make a rule with her name on it. Liam helped carry the trunk to Kathleen's assigned berths and found his breath shortened not by the work but by the sight of so many beds pretending to be hope at once. He set the box, wiped his hands on his trousers. There is always tar in the world of rope sand. Looked at Sean. You ever cross? He asked. I've crossed worse, Sean said. Once I kept a digger's camp from killing itself by teaching men to walk to water in pairs. This is like that tonally wetter. He showed the older boy a sailor's trick for tying a line so a tin won't swing against your neighbor's head when the ship finds her feet. Dan watched with the hunger he now reserved for anything that made the world behave. Above, the whistle blew not to be beautiful but to be obeyed. Lines came off bollards. The gap between ship and quay widened the way arguments do, slowly and then with a certainty that makes you dizzy. Men through last looks like ropes that never caught. A girl lost her courage for 1 second and then found its hem and held on. Kavanagh stood at the edge, like a door he couldn't close or open, and took off his hat, because sometimes a head expects the sky to rest on it. Father. Donnelly made the sign of the cross in the Erinchtui, as if asking God to remember something he'd promised, and then put his hand on Moira's shoulder. She stood very straight for a woman watching a piece of her heart go walking onto water. "We've a list to make," she said after a while, as if her mouth needed something that wasn't goodbye. "Windows owing pennies. I'll collect. It will feel like chasing geese first, but geese are decent once you talk to them." Eileen Keating had brought rolls wrapped in damp cloths, the last of last night's bake, because soft things are rare at docks. She pressed one into Mary Quinn's hand at arm's length and refused thanks with a look. "Pay it forward on the other side." Pritchard appeared, startling himself with a folded sheet. "Names," he told the captain's mate. "Kin in Dublin. For when you return, someone will ask." The mate, who had never known a clerk as a kind of courage before, tucked the paper into a tin with his tobacco. Men of the water know how to keep what matters dry. The river was steering them now. The city slid a little. Voices thinned. Mothers pressed blankets around children with a competence that felt like defiance. The younger constable raised a hand, without meaning to, as the ship eased away, as if he were hailing a friend he didn't know he had made. He put the hand down when he noticed it. Men like to pretend their hearts are not in their wrists. Below decks, the first hour belonged to the Syots' introductions, its old joke about balance. The Sarah Ann leaned left. People leaned right. Someone laughed, which made it less frightening, until the lean reversed and children decided their stomachs owed them nothing. Buckets appeared. Shame didn't. A woman hummed a line of something sweet in a minor key. The way women bake sugar into bread so it seems like a meal. Night found them already far enough that the city's lamps were only a smudge. On deck, stars came down to inspect the masts. Sailors named them things that had to do with land, plough, ladder, beer jug. In steerage, a small order established itself without anyone voting, old to the wall. Infants near the warm pipe, the young men on the aisle so they could get to the buckets, and to any trouble before it woke children. Mrs. Burns' slate made its round, Ashling and Nuala for breakfast water, Michael for the sweep, Eman for the galley fire under the cook's eye, Kathleen for the infant soaking pan. She wrote songs beside a name here and there. Singing keeps men from arguments the way pepper keeps meat from flies. The doctorship's surgeon, Evans, with clever hands and a mustache that had forgot laughter, walked through with a lamp trimmed low. He touched foreheads, asked about coughs, sniffed water casks like he loved them, he did. Water and doctors are kin. He stopped at Mary Quinn's birth. "How many days?" he asked. "Eye on the infant, not the mother." 3 months, Mary said, and fortitude climbed into her throat to make space. "He's mending of a fever. We feed him slow." "Aye," Evans said. "Slow wins more races than men want to admit." He showed her how to pinch a drop from a rag at the corner of the child's mouth, so swallowing forgot it was work. He moved on. He would save 10, lose 5, hate himself for the 5, and go on because hands are stubborn. Wind had the run of the second day. the ship learned to breathe. People learned to move without apologizing to air. On deck, men stretched their spines and took that first gulp of weather that says, "I did not die yet." Below, Maggie taught the younger of Kathleen's boys the rope trick Dan had mastered, and the boys showed Aoife a game with a button and a loop that required smarts and luck in exactly the measure. God gives to children. At noon, the mate banged. The bell and the first mess was ladled. A stew that was 90% water and 10% fish and memory. Still, it was hot and honest, and hot and honest are two blessings even on land. Buckets came back clean. Mrs. Byrne checked tins like a quartermaster and found only 2 that needed the sides scraped again. She praised the boys like soldiers, and the boys stood taller for the foolishness of it. The third day, the ship met the Atlantic properly. A heave came up from the deep, the kind that tells your stomach it has never really met you. Berths banged. A child cried in a voice that made everyone remember someone else. The Sarah Ann dipped and rose. The captain shouted a word you are not supposed to say in front of nuns. There were no nuns, but Sister Agnes would have approved it. Sometimes vocabulary is a life-saving instrument. At dusk, a quarrel started, the small kind that sinks 2 inches and can drown you if you don't get your feet under you. 2 men argued about a place for a pot and launched old country grievances across 6 inches of aisle. Sean, who had a degree in such matters, stepped to the boil and did what he always does, named the thing before it grew teeth. "This is fear," he said, "not loud, not soft. Fear thinks it's clever to put on your coat and speak in your voice. Don't let it move the pot. Trade pillows. Save your sharp for the storm." He put his body where the pot had been and looked foolish for 10 heartbeats. The men laughed at him and then at themselves. The ship exhaled. That night, under a sky that forgot to be stingy with stars, Father Donnelly stood at the rail with Kavanagh, who'd walked the quay patrol and come only this far. Far enough to feel the pull, not far enough to leave. "They'll sing," the priest said, listening below as somebody tried on a ballad that had more verses than good sense. "They'll fight too," Kavanagh said. "They'll do both." Donnelly answered, "The trick is making sure fight doesn't learn the tune." Back in Dublin, Dr. Crawford wrote a line that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with how a city thinks of itself. Ship gone, hospital quieter, by 3 beds. Quieter is not peace. Nurse Brigid drew a little mast next to it badly. Keating, at his desk, ran numbers that included months and men and pride. Eileen set a mug by his elbow and didn't ask if the figures added. Marriage is sometimes a decision to trust a man's sums, even when the column looks impossible. Sister Agnes wrote a new chalk rule on St. Patrick's wall. If you have news, bring IT under it in smaller letters. Speak plain. Moira began her penny tour and collected more stories than coins. She kept both. On the 5th day, the Sarah Ann's doctor found a rash on a boy's belly, small as a map of a country only fever knows. He closed his eyes briefly for an unprofessional prayer and set to work. Separate him to leeward, he told the mate, air sponging, no sharing cups. He said it like he had authority over such things. He knew he didn't, but pretending helps other people pretend. And sometimes pretending makes a truth break surface. Mary's baby held his swallow like a promise. Kathleen's boys turned, sloshing into sport. Maggie found that her hands could calm a child who wasn't her sister, new competence, old instinct. At midnight, Sean sat with a widow by the hatch, because the widow had forgotten how to be awake without thinking of what she'd left. He told her a story about ropes learning, patience in winter. The ship kept moving. It's what ships do, when men give them wind and women allow them hope. One afternoon, the mate posted a notice near the galley: inspection of berths. Cleanliness required. He made his voice stern and avoided looking at the corner where the poorest beddings lay. Mrs. Byrne turned the inspection into a game for the children. Bess made Berthwin's first ladle. Beds were squared, blankets shaken, tins nested like plans. When the mate came with his chalk, he tried not to smile and failed. He put checks where checks had been earned. He put a dot beside the berth where a woman had tied a ribbon to make it her own. The sea does not award ribbons. People do. On the 8th day, wind fell. The ocean flattened itself and asked for patience. The cook stretched flour into something like dumplings, and the smell of onion became nearly a suggestion of feast. Songs dared longer verses. The boys taught Aoife to whistle through her teeth, the way Doyle does. She produced a sound like a kettle deciding what to be. Someone shouted porpoise, and half the ship ran to look grey, backs breaking like hands clapping quietly for a joke you told correctly. Even the captain's mouth relaxed enough to think about a smile, and then remembered itself. The 9th day. A storm came like an unpaid bill. It arrived at dinner, rude, and knocked spoons out of hands. The Sarah Ann leaned hard. The lamp swung, a tin went skittering. The doctor tied his bag to his belt. The mate tied everything else to something not going anywhere. A child screamed and then laughed because someone told him. He was braver than the wind, and he believed it for the 1 second most useful to him. This is not the night to tell of burials. That is a tale for another part too hard to fold into. A chapter that began with tickets and pretended this would be simple. This is the night to say that some ships ride, whether because men remember their knots and women remember their lists, and somebody remembers to sing past the hour written on the plank. Near midnight, Sean braced his back against a post and told a story you cannot find in any book, a small, foolish tale about a man who bargained with the ocean and accidentally won a gull's respect. It wasn't good. It was, however, exactly right. People breathed in time with sentences. The ship found her feet, then lost them, then found them again. The storm got bored. Storms do. You can bore anything if you're stubborn enough and keep the buckets moving. Morning came like forgiveness, clumsy but willing. The sky was the color of tin and hope. The deck glistened with work. Below, Mrs. Byrne's slate had a new column. Lost none. She sat down hard and cried when no one could see, and then scolded a boy for putting his tin on the wrong shelf, because dignity must be maintained or the sea will inhale you. Far behind. Dublin turned pages the ship would not see. A new pot at St. Patrick's, smaller, cleaner, poorer. A debt marked part paid in Keating's ledger. A ward at the Meath where the Doyle girl opened her eyes and said, "Tommy," before remembering to breathe again. Kavanagh, who had never played at poetry, leaned on a doorway and admitted to himself that he had stood with his hand up as the ship leapt, and he did not feel foolish. The younger constable practiced writing his own name cleanly. A man who can write his name will sign something one day that matters. Out on the grey wide, the Sarah Ann pointed her wooden face toward a country that had sold itself hard to every hungry ear from Skibbereen to Smithfield. The ship held men and women whose names were now tied to ropes and lists and a captain's mood. It also held something nobody had measured at the foot of the gangplank, a city's skill at staying human. They had packed it without knowing, rolled into blankets, stitched into songs, folded into the trick where you make two children share the last spoon and believe they both got more. They would need it. There were still weeks of water. There was still fever with its quiet feet. There were still burials, and a day when land would appear too far off to believe in, and then, all at once, too near to bear. But tonight, under a sky that had finally put stars in their proper places, the ship moved and did not sink, and men slept who thought they'd forgotten how Dot back on Francis's street. Nora felt baby John's breath under her palm count steady into the dark. Liam lay on his good side and listened for the ocean with his eyes closed. He could not hear it. He could hear the city, though the little changes a place makes after it has chosen to behave well for an afternoon. He thought of a door that had remembered itself. He thought of a key left on a desk. He thought of letters a clerk had copied twice. He thought, without speaking it into the room, that when the Sarah Ann reached wherever she meant to reach, Dublin would still be here needing lists and ladles and the kind of law that keeps its stick low. Burials at sea storms leave fingerprints. The Sarah Ann wore hers quietly the next morning, ropes a shade greyer with dried salt. A hairline welt in the rail where a crate had learned to fly, bruises turning colors on men who pretended not to notice. Below, people woke with that cautious relief that comes after a night you expected not to finish. The stew pot went on. The water cask was eyed like a saint. Someone discovered a biscuit with no weevil and kissed it for luck. The boy with the rash did not improve. Ship's surgeon Evans had set him to leeward 2 days earlier space, sponging the careful rationing of water that feels cruel and sometimes isn't. He'd done what doctors do when medicine is mostly hands and hope. Cooled the brow, watched the chest, spoken nonsense kindly so a child could climb it like a ladder back toward sense. The boy's name was Michael Hanratty, 11. A weaver's son out of the Liberties, travelling with an aunt who had already lost too much and whose eyes had learned to look as if every minute was either gift or thief. Michael's fever had the tidy cruelty of typhus, the kind that sits very still while it wins. Evans could not lie to himself. He could lie only to the aunt, and even then only in small, necessary ways. Another day, he'd said twice, the way men say, another mile, 2 feet that have forgotten what a road is for. This morning, when the doctor laid 2 fingers under the boy's jaw, the pulse miscounted, and then forgot arithmetic entirely. Evans took his hand away and looked at the woman. She had the strange alert stillness people wear in rooms that have stopped being the rooms they were. He knelt the way sailors kneel, sure of his knees on a moving floor, and spoke low. "He's gone," he said, the only sentence that does not ask to be understood. She didn't cry, not then. She made the small mechanical movement of drawing the blanket up and smoothing it once, as if neatness could keep the world from unraveling further. Then she leaned and kissed the boy's forehead, long enough to call it by every name she had ever had for him. After that she stood and stepped back without falling, which is a kind of miracle the sea demands and seldom thanks you for. Word moved below deck in the way it does when it knows it should lower its voice. Mrs. Burns set down her ladle and, without making an announcement, put her hand to the slate and added a column that hadn't existed yesterday: wakes. She went to the galley and asked the cook for a bit of strong tea. He offered rum, which she refused, and then offered a clean cloth, which she took. You honour the dead with sensible things. First Sean came and sat where sailors sit when they are not pretending to be busy. He made a space around the aunt with the kind of quiet that says you don't owe anyone a performance. Maggie drifted closer with Aoife, and Don children learn fast when to be small and still. Kathleen brought her boys, and, without thinking, took the younger one's hand from his pocket. Mothers scan for fingers to hold when words are too heavy to carry. There are rules for burials at sea, the old kind that live in men's hands more than in books. Captain Hale sent for canvas and the sailmaker's palm. He hated this part, he hated that it had a part. He ordered the main well off the wind so the ship would ride gently for once, and the deck would remember how to be floor instead of slope. The mate went for a bit of chain and 2 lumps of shot. Gravity is a kind of priest at sea, Evans asked softly, a lock. And the aunt nodded. He cut 1 curl with a surgeon's care and placed it in her palm. She closed her fingers and put the hair into the lining of her dress, the way a woman puts faith in a pocket, and goes on. They wrapped the boy in canvas, the color of sails, before the wind has taught them anything. The sailmaker's needle is a small spear. The line is waxed to go through without argument. The last stitch, by sailor's custom, passes through the nose knot to wound, but to ask the oldest question one more time. Evans did it without making ceremony of it. The captain looked away because even men who live with the ocean's particular math do not like to see things proved. The plank they used was a hatch cover laid upon 2 trestles. One of the boys, by the look of it, had smudged a tiny cross on the wood with galley charcoal. No one said who. The doctor stood at the head, the captain at the foot, the mate on one side, Sean on the other, because sailors stand by sailors, even when youth hasn't earned the title yet. Mrs. Byrne took the aunt's arm in both of hers, and held on as if wind might try some trick. There was no priest to speak the old Latin, and no book of common prayer to put Anglican English around the hole in the world. Words came anyway, because words will. Captain Hole coughed once, and then found the sentence he knew from ships where chaplains were scarce. "We commit this body to the deep," he said, voice careful as a knot. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection, he did not force the last 3 words to convince anybody. He simply set them down where they belonged. Father Donnelly would have approved of the restraint. Below the plank, the Atlantic was the exact color of gravity blue, far off, black right here. The ship's wake made its own white handwriting in the water that nobody could read twice. The wind had gone clerical. It stood still for the service. The aunt began a Hail Mary, and others joined the way voices do when a street knows a prayer. By muscle memory, it wasn't loud. It had the intimacy of a lullaby sung after the child has fallen asleep, somewhere near the mast. A Protestant sailor held his hat to his chest and counted the knots along the brim, because men get to have habits too. When the last amen found its landing, Captain Hale nodded to the mate. They lifted the far edge of the plank and let canvas take on the shape of falling. For one instant the boy lay on the knife of the world neither deck nor sea, then he went into the water that keeps its own counsel. The weights did their blunt office. The surface erased itself. That quick, that clean, that cruel, no one clapped. The crew put the plank aside and the hatch back where it belonged. The deck dislikes being without purpose. The aunt finally cried, and the sound did what grief's first sound always does. It taught everyone else where to put theirs. Mrs. Byrne steered her gently toward the lee with the tea. She had bullied out of the cook and a clean cloth that gave the hands something safe to ruin. Evans wrote the boy's name in the ship's log. Michael Hanratty, 11 fever. The ink looked too thin. He dried the line with sand and shut the book as if that made the fact at least behave. The day kept going, because days are rude. The cook burned onions. The mate scolded a boy for letting a bucket swing. A gull laughed like a woman with a mean sense of humor and then remembered itself and went silent. By evening, the sea had remembered how to be merely large instead of infinite. People ate, not out of appetite, but duty. Duty is a good enough reason some nights. Not long after sundown, trouble came for an old man too. His name was Donald Riley Cooper, once a storyteller by compulsion, traveling alone because loneliness can be packed lighter than family. He had been the kind who makes a corner of a room warmer by sitting in it. Yesterday he'd begun to breathe like a man trying to find a word that wouldn't come. Evans listened with his ear and wanted to be wrong. Tonight the breath went thin and hasty and then stopped pretending to be a plan at all. The second burial was smaller. Grief is a finite substance. Some of it had already been spent. Still, the ship made the effort of respect. Another length of canvas, another bit of chain, another plank. Sean said a few words that weren't very good, and were therefore perfect. He told us stories while we pretended they were for the children, he said. He'll have an audience that can't interrupt him, poor souls. The sea took Donnell without remark. Older men go like that, navigated by tides they've known. Before, the log grew another line. Evans closed it harder this time, as if that could teach the world restraint. After, while the ship's lamp swung its careful arc and children finally slept with the flattery exhaustion gives them, singing found the seams between bunks. Not loud Mrs. Burns' rules weren't suggestions, but steady. A woman began the parting glass under her breath, and half the steerage found the harmony without deciding to. When she reached good night and joy be with you all, she did not sob on the last word. She made it sound like a thing that could be true again. Above, Captain Hales stood his trick at the rail and pretended he was counting stars. The mate came and stood shoulder to shoulder because men are not islands. They are keys built close enough that voices carry. Bad for morale, the mate said, meaning burials. Good for order, the captain answered, not because he liked the sentence but because he had seen what shared rituals make possible. They will sleep now. Better than if we had done paperwork and nothing else. On deck, the young sailor who had chalked the charcoal cross scrubbed it away with his sleeve. Sailors are superstitious. They don't leave maps for grief. He made another, smaller, near his own berth, where only he would trip over it. The next morning, the ship looked practically the same and absolutely different. People made room for the ant without making a performance of it. The boys helped with the sweep without being told twice. The galley queue breathed in time. Anger has a rhythm, and so does mercy, and the trick is to keep the first from teaching the second its bad habits. Mary Quinn brought baby Paddy to the ant's corner and set him in the woman's arms. "Hold him while I wash this tin," she said. Not because she needed the help, but because hands that have let go want to wait again. The baby slept the entire time, which is the kindest thing an infant can do as a sacrament. Kathleen's eldest wrapped a length of rope around his waist, the way he'd seen Sean do, and showed the younger boys a knot that would not unkindly pull tight under strain. Good for buckets, better for promises. The younger constable was not there to learn it. On a different key, in a different city, he was writing his name slowly until every letter obeyed. At noon, Evans checked on a small miracle. Mary's boy fever, broken days ago, swallow training itself into a habit, had added an ounce to himself. It is difficult for an ounce to brag, but it tried. Slow winds, Evans told Mary again, and this time the sentence did not sound like a thing a doctor says to feel useful. Even the captain felt the edge dull. He ate standing with his plate on the rail and remembered the dead in the efficient way of a man who has to measure his ghosts so they don't mutiny. He let the ship ride a half point easier than the chart demanded. No one noticed but the mate, who pretended he hadn't. Far off, dolphins came like punctuation to someone else's. Sentence up, down, flash, gone. Children squealed with the kind of joy that scares no fish and heals some adults. Sean said they were the souls of sailors gone ahead to scout. Mrs. Byrne lacked the energy to scold his theology. Beneath this water, now part of it, were two names. Names matter. The mate wrote them again in his own small notebook because the log belongs to the ship, but a man's notebook belongs to his pocket, and pockets travel further than books sometimes. He added a foolish detail for each boy liked the button game. The old man told the one about the cow that learned Latin because bare names are too cold for the Atlantic. Back in Dublin, the day kept its own accounts. St. Patrick's pot was thinner than yesterday and richer than last month. Sister Agnes counted the pennies. Moira had hurried out of window debtors and found enough to put a loaf on the Keating fine without selling Eileen's ring. She made a mark on the chalk wall, fine, paid, then smudged it half away because life never stays underlined for long. Keating brought the bond home and set it under the ledger at night and above it in the morning. He had 3 small contracts for local flour miller deciding to be Irish first, a baker deciding he was sick of the taste of English obligations, a parish committee with more belief than money. Pritchard sharpened 3 pencils to points that made even numbers stand straight at the Meath. Dr. Crawford caught a berth on his noon round. The fevered mother had laboured quietly, as if making a bargain with a clock. The baby came out, astonished, which is to say, alive. Nurse Bridget laughed once, the kind of laugh that startles walls into liking you, and told the child he owed them nothing yet. Crawford washed his hands and did not write anything grand in the journal. He wrote, 2 dead at sea, 1 born here. He drew a line between them only in his mind, then erased even that, because comparisons are a vulgarity grief and joy don't deserve. Kavanagh carried a sack of turf up 3 flights for an old widow on his beat and left it by the hearth without waking her. The younger constable took his tea at Nora's fire because Liam had decided men who do hard things are allowed to look at a baby that breathes steadily for a quarter hour while somebody else holds him. Night came in its ordinary coat. On the Sarah Ann, Mrs. Byrne added to her slate a rule she had never before risked writing: retell the names after mess. When the ship had that soft quiet of a thing moving well with itself, she read the day's list of tasks, then said, Hanratty, Michael, Riley, Donnell, and after each waited for one memory. Michael could make a loop with one hand. Dan offered, which is a sailor's compliment, even if a boy says it. Donnell told me what a Cooper's adze looks like, said Kathleen's eldest, lifting his hand in the air and curving it like a blade. He said barrels are like people. Too tight and nothing useful gets in. Too loose and you waste what you hold. The ship listened. The sea didn't argue. You don't teach the ocean much, but you can inform it of your rituals. The captain, who would have chewed a rope before allowing himself a sentiment, found himself lingering near the hatch to hear the last of it. He went to the rail and peered out into a darkness that did not care who stared into it. After a time, he took a step back toward the warmth and allowed himself one guilty thought: there are worse congregations than this. By Lantern Evans opened the log again and traced the 2 written lines with one finger. He added a 3rd line beneath them in pencil, not officials. so faint it would disappear if the book got wet. Remember to be kind to the living while you can still write their names. Then he snapped the covers shut, lest he grow a taste for poetry and become useless. The Sarah Ann ran on, small under a sky that had finally forgiven the day for doing what days do. In her belly slept people who had learned 3 new skills in a week: how to stand on a moving floor, how to share without letting pride starve, how to say goodbye without breaking in half. They would use all 3 again. Behind them, Dublin kept doing its own brave arithmetic, turning doors into doors, fines into loaves, strangers into neighbours. Ahead, there was water enough to make a saint curse and a sailor sing, and somewhere, toward a horizon that refused to hurry its revelations, a smear of coastline waited to grow into America. Land smells different from memory when you've crossed an ocean to reach it. It doesn't smell like the picture you kept in your head, the tidy harbor from a handbill, the sunrise that behaved. It smells of coal and horses and tar that never dries, of pine boards newly sawn to make houses for other arrivals, of coffee boiled to impatience in shore kitchens, and beneath all of that a quick, cold sweetness off the water that says, "You will not tame me, but we can bargain." On the 12th morning after the storm, the Sarah Ann woke to a belt of pale light laid along her port side. The sea shifted color as if it remembered a promise. Before anyone said the word, people smelled. Harbor, children were first to stand. They always are, because joy has short legs and rises quickly. Men pretended they were only stretching backs. Women tightened shawls as if there was some dignity in being neat for a coastline. Boston came along gradually, testing everyone's eyesight. First a low seemed darker than the horizon, then shapes, a lighthouse at the edge of sensibility, a thread of smoke that belonged to a mill, a black tick that became a tug. And then, all at once, a city, a collection of choices in wood and brick. Roofs like folded hands, masts stippling the sky where streets reached the water. Bells tried themselves and found the right notes. A gull laughed as if it had been here the whole time and only now remembered to be rude. The ship slowed to a gate proper for its entrance. Captain Hale stood with his hand on the rail and his mouth a lineman who've seen land as a ledger, do not spend it quickly. The mate checked signals and answered with a flag that skipped like a good pen. The doctor shut his bag and opened it again. Quarantine first, always quarantine. The Board of Health had a building out on the flats, a square thing with a widow's look, and a small dock where boats came and went with the precision of a heartbeat. "Dear Island," someone whispered. The word hopped bunk to bunk with the nerves of a rumor made sensible. Orders traveled, and the last hour became a list made flesh. Tins stacked, berths checked for blankets, and nothing else do. Not accidentally take a coil of ship's rope, unless you crave the taste of a bosun's temper. The slate went round one more time, buckets scoured, infants wrapped, letters ready. Mrs. Byrne had been making people write for 3 days. "You won't remember the words later," she'd said, pressing blunt pencils into hands. "Right now, while the ocean is still in your ears to keep you honest." They anchored out where the harbor pilots like to think and sent the longboat for the inspector. He arrived in a coat that said he believed in institutions and a face that said he had been taught not to gamble with breath. Dr. Evans met him halfway up the ladder and murmured the summaries no man wants. 2 burials, 1 infection, now cooling. The general run of stairs that had learned how to sleep. The inspector nodded as if agreeing with a ledger. He washed his hands in vinegar as if to satisfy an argument with the air. "Names," he said, to the captain. Names, the captain said to the mate. Names, the mate said to Mrs. Byrne, who already had them in a list so neat it could have served as a ruler. They filed past the inspector like a congregation at communion. He lifted eyelids with a polite finger, peered at tongues, pressed thumbs to wrists, and counted to 4. He chalked the clean coats of those who passed with a quiet mark that meant go to shore, but slowly. Those who needed an extra look were asked to sit aside. Mary Quinn with baby Paddy came through with the smallest nod from Dr. Evans. Slow had won a race. Nobody cheered loudly, but the doctor's eyes gave themselves permission to shine once. Deer Island for 24 hours. The inspector said finally, not cruelly, if the night is a good one, you'll taste city bread by tomorrow. The groan that went around the deck wasn't anger. It was the relief of not being fooled. Every person aboard already knew that you don't step from ocean to street in one stride. A threshold is a ritual. The longboat took them in squads. A rhythm of leaving that gave goodbyes, a cadence. Sean went ashore with the first boat under a pretense of carrying rope and a certainty of coming back. Able seamen are like that. They taste land to prove it's real, then return because loyalty is a habit you cannot take off. He promised the boys a sweet by evening and swore at the gulls for playing with the line. The gulls kept their jokes. Deer Island was clean in the way hospitals are clean soap that refuses to be subtle, whitewash with opinions. A nurse whose eyebrows can organize a room. Blankets were issued that had seen 30 ships. A ward with open windows took the coughs. A separate room took the fear and tried to teach it manners. They slept on straw that did not move, and if anyone woke in the night with panic wearers, the sound of water. Why is the floor unfaithful in this new way? There was a cup of something hot and a mutter from a woman who knew how to make comfort sound like chores. By noon the next day, the inspector's chalk had forgiven them. The Sarah Ann was allowed to the wharf proper. The city approached at a walking pace, the way a future is supposed to. There was a cheer short, practical, unprescient. Then a quiet fell as every person made a private treaty with the sight of streets that didn't know them. Disembarkation is a dance invented by clocks. The gangplank thudded in its socket. The crewman at the foot became a doorman to a new country. Care there, he said, without malice. Watch that last inch as if it were a mile. People did. Shoes found wood that belonged to Boston instead of England or Ireland or the ocean's stubborn citizenship. A few knelt, not because superstition demanded it, but because knees sometimes know more than heads about what you've just done. The dock swarmed with the organisms that live on harbors. Runners with boarding house cards stuck in their hats like feathers. Men with carts who can persuade you that your trunk wants to ride. Women with bread whose smell writes its own invitation. Pasted on a wall behind them, a notice in tall letters tried to sound like law. No John Doe's Irish need apply. Kathleen looked at it with the calm outrage of somebody who has seen worse signs work, or Deanne decided this new sentence would not get to live in her head rent-free. Moira's niece had a word in her pocket. Fort Hill, given by a cousin who had crossed the year before and written back on paper, thin as a prayer. Come to Fort Hill. It is a slum. We have a fire. There is a woman here who knows how to turn coffee into patience. She and her boys shouldered the trunk and followed the crowd-level current toward the part of town where Irish voices already made the air behave a little like home. Mary Quinn went the same direction, baby covered with Nora's mended shoulder, one that had learned to be a roof and a blanket and a spell. Sean had shore leave and a pocket with 3 honest coins and one dishonest plan. Boarding house first, he told them, like a pilot finding a tide. You choose it, don't let it choose you. He steered them past the loudest callers, to a place with a tin coffee pot on the sill and washing strung across like flags. The keeper, Mrs. Flynn, corked by birth, Boston by necessity, looked them up and down with a midwife's eye. She named a price that would make you wince, and then shaved a bits off for the sight of a child sleeping upright in a shawl. Back steps are for crying, she said, without softness. Front rooms for plans, tea at 4. If you've strength to work, you'll find a broom in the corner that never tires. Boston's day began to sort itself around them. A parish priest from St. Mary's, not their father Donnelly, but a cousin in temperament, came with a list of employers who preferred to pretend the sign on the wall was for other people. A woman from a sewing room measured Kathleen's arms with her eye and nodded. You'll do. A man from the docks pointed at Mary's shawl and said, Baby's got a good colour. There's a fishmonger wants a woman who can wrap paper without wasting any, can you? Mary could buy evening. They had their first American meal bread, with a little sweetness in it. Chowder that had the manners to be hot. Coffee that was bitter and honest. The boys loved the bread, complained about the chowder, and fell asleep with spoons in their hands. Mrs. Flynn plucked the spoons gently and laid them out as if to dry. That night, before the boarding house settled into its chorus pipes, hissing, floorboards remarking, babies arguing with sleep, Sean took out the letter he had written on the island and the coins he had hoarded without telling himself to. Pious, a story about it. He added the first wages Kathleen had been handed for half a day's mending and the fishmonger's advance, wrapped the small pile in paper, and wrote on the front in a hand that had learned patience in bad weather, St. Patrick's Yard, Francis Street, Dublin. Care of Sister Agnes. Inside he'd written, We arrived. The doctor is clever. The coffee is an acquired taste. Fort Hill has a spine. Mary's boy breathes like a metronome. Tell Liam I found a knot used here that is wrong, and I will fix Boston personally. Tell Nora the shawl sits like a benediction in a house that needed teaching. Tell Father Donnelly that the ocean can be bored into courtesy. Tell Keating that doors are still doors this side. If you need a number, $3 enclosed. More when my hands remember all the ropes they ever knew. Scene sealed it, walked to the post office with Kathleen's eldest, and showed the boy how to buy a stamp with a dignity that made the clerk soften without knowing it. They watched the letter vanish into a slot that promised miracles. The boy asked, Will it find them? And Sean answered the way all sailors do about distances they cannot see. Across the ocean, Dublin performed its ordinary heroism. On Francis Street, a letter arrived under a rain that decided not to overdo it. The postboy knew the Francis Street trickie went to St. Patrick's first when the address was unsure. Sister Agnes wiped glue off the flap with a thumbnail. Read, and then read again out loud in the yard to anyone with ears. Liam laughed at the not insult and swore to send an argument by the next boat. Nora pressed the wrapped money flat under the big ledger with exactly the ceremony it deserved, enough to teach the children that money is a tool, not a god. Keating made his second payment on the bond with coins that had been argued out of reluctant pockets and earned with days that began too early. Pritchard created a column called Remitted, and under it started a list of sums arriving from Boston, Quebec, New York, St. John. The city is teaching itself a new arithmetic, he said, half to the paper, half to his astonishment. Eileen found flour at a price that didn't insult her grandmother and baked 3 dozen rolls that rose as if they understood a bed is something to grow out of, not drown in. Dr. Crawford delivered a set of twins that made the ward clap once quickly, then look contrite, as if happiness were a crime in a building where grief paid most of the rent. Nurse Bridget scolded their mother for apologizing and tucked an extra blanket round the smaller twin with a ferocity that dared the wind to try anything clever. Moira's ledger of pennies became a ledger of names, window debtors turned donors. Overnight, she learned which men could be trusted with a collection tin, and which needed to be given a list and a companion with sharp elbows. She took tea with Kavanagh once, purely by accident, and told him he had done right in a yard that wasn't his to dignify. He stared at his cup as if a map might appear in it, and said, "A man likes to be told that by a woman who knows what a door is for." The younger constable wrote Michael Hanratty into his pocketbook from the letter's mention, and then crossed it out because the ocean had already taken the entry. But he wrote it again under retell the names, a rule he'd heard from a sailor with a bad song and a good heart. He kept the page. Men surprised themselves like that at St. Patrick's. Sister Agnes erased fine, paid and wrote bond. Behaving, she added 2 smaller rules below that nobody asked for and everybody needed. Write back, sing anyway. Fort Hill learned the rules of being a settlement the way all settlements do, through arguments and loans, and the quick grace of sharing that requires no speeches. The boys carried water like men and swapped out swearing for new words they would later deny learning. Mary wrapped paper for the fishmonger faster than anyone expected and brought home a sliver of cod that tasted like the sea when it's feeling generous. Kathleen mended sleeves until her back made decisions without consulting her, then took in 3 children for an afternoon when their mother had found a day's scrubbing. She was paid in a pie that contained more ambition than meat, and was perfect. On Sundays, St. Mary's filled with faces that had chosen to make a parish out of strangers. The priest's voice learned to stretch over accents. He preached too long. Nobody minded. Outside, notices grew on the walls like a second alphabet. Rooms, work, senders wanted. The ugly sign appeared again and again in shop windows. Nitrogen monoxide, Irish. Need apply, and again was answered by hands taking whatever other door was open. If a wall says no, Mrs. Flynn told her boarders, learn the wall. It has a back. On a clear Tuesday, Sean stood on the Sarah Ann's deck again, a coil in his hands and Boston going small behind him. He touched the rail where 2 palms had gripped during the burials and tapped it twice. Not superstition, exactly, respect. Captain Hale grunted what, for him, passed as blessing. Mrs. Byrne thrust a handkerchief at him he didn't need and said, "Bring it back, filthy. It's unlucky to return a cloth clean if you've been at sea." Dr. Evans handed him a folded paper with a copy of the names the mate had written in his pocketbook. "In case Dublin needs reminding, it is part owner of our dead," he said. Sean tucked the list near his heart because sailors and nuns sometimes agree on placement. The ship bent itself to the work of going the other way, from the fort to... Boys waved wildly. Sean didn't look back a second time. He had learned the trick from fishermen who say a second look lets the ocean count you too carefully. He hummed something like a hymn and told himself a bad joke about gulls. The gulls answered with a derisive flourish and then accompanied the ship a mile for free. Evenings in Boston began to develop that Dublin undertone, a note beneath noise that says we have learned each other's names and we aren't giving them back. In a boarding house room, Mary wrote a letter with help from a girl 2 doors down who'd taught herself penmanship by copying shop signs. Baby eats. I wrap paper faster than the fishmonger can talk. The streets are a sort of river. You stand on the bank until you find a way to step without drowning. Kiss anyone who will allow it for me. Kathleen added a postscript. Tell Aunt Moira the coffee is a law, not a suggestion. They enclosed a dollar bill and, for bravery, a note promising more. Back on Francis Street, Nora read that letter out loud with baby John on her knee, practicing a laugh that sounded like a ladder. Don traced the dollar's ink, careful not to smudge history. Liam rolled his shoulder once, the good side checking on the bad, and said, "We owe them answers." He took up a pencil that had belonged to a schoolmaster who still came to the yard to see what the city thought it was building. He wrote slowly, "Your names are in our mouths. The door is still a door. Time, like a tide, learnt a schedule. The worst winter passed. Not all bellies were full, but fewer were players in that terrible lottery where grief and arithmetic collude. Keating paid the bond month by month with the stubborn pleasure of a man building a habit he intends to keep. Pritchard, who had thought himself a clerk and discovered he was a steward, taught other shopkeepers how to keep a second column labelled Mercy and balance it without going under. Sister Agnes added a small, indelible rule to the top of her wall where rain couldn't reach.